Good afternoon and welcome. It's great to see this group sitting in this room. I'm Ruth Mandel, director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. It's a pleasure, it's an honor, it's a delight to welcome you to a very special event for all of us, and certainly for us at Eagleton, and I hope for all of you in the room. We're here to consider the administration of Governor James J. Florio, and we're delighted and honored to have you with us for this happy occasion, Governor Florio. It's been a long time in the making. We've had many interesting conversations about it, and I think we've got a terrific, I'm going to say a terrific program, but in a way, I think of this as a group interview, because it's all of you who did this together, and we're recording it for posterity, and we have an occasion to hear about that, hear about it from memory's perspective, and hear about it as you see it today. We'll look forward to hearing from many of you shortly. I do want to say that we're very sorry that Lucinda Florio was unable to join us for this important day. Fortunately, we'll have video of the program for her to enjoy later. For those of you who don't know, there are risks in getting a new puppy. And she has a few stitches to prove that. But please send her our regards and best wishes. Today's program showcases the most recent efforts of Eagleton's Center on the American Governor. In 2006, the Rutgers libraries were the fortunate recipient of a gift from former Governor Brendan Byrne, who donated papers and other memorabilia from his distinguished career in Trenton. He and his wife Ruth raised funds to support processing, cataloging, and preserving the materials at Rutgers. This coincided. They were doing this, and then we had been thinking about balancing some of the work that we've been doing on the legislative side with the executive side. So it coincided with Eagleton's interest in complementing our longstanding work on state legislatures with a new focus on state executive leadership. Perhaps it will surprise you. I think I've said it to some of you on various occasions, but I want it to be on the record again. We were so surprised to learn that nowhere in this vast country is there an academic center devoted to the study of the office of governor. Eagleton and Rutgers aim not only to take on that role, but to do it with distinction and to begin with a special emphasis on our own Garden State. And notably, while this center studies history, we're designing it to utilize evolving technologies and with an online archive of documents, images, and publications, and a series of video interviews with each recent elected governor and key associates. These will be available forever in this state and beyond, so that if someone does decide in Oregon to study the office of governor in New Jersey and elsewhere, we hope we will have the best national resource. They will be able to tune into it and further their studies without actually having to come here in person, although I'm sure we'll welcome anyone who wants to come and study here as well. We're also ensuring that noteworthy events, including today's program, are recorded and also made available online for present and for the researchers I've just mentioned, and also, of course, for political practitioners. We hope it will be useful for people in the future who are putting together an administration or at a particular moment in administration to be able to turn to what we have in the experience here in New Jersey to give them some guidance, to give them some advice. We're well on our way to compiling Brendan Byrne's virtual archive, and the Kane virtual archive is not too far behind. We're able to take today's step in establishing the Florio virtual archive in large measure because of support provided by many of you in this room. We want to thank all of you and all of our contributors for their generosity and their foresight in preserving this important historical record. Many, many people have helped us to make all of this possible, and there's no way to introduce and thank all of them by name. But I do want to acknowledge and call on a colleague here at Eagleton who has played a central role on the team that is developing the Center on the American Governor, and especially the Governor Florio section. He is John Weingarth, Eagleton's Associate Director, who has, and I chose this word carefully, who has lovingly devoted many hours, contributed his formidable knowledge of the Florio administration and state government, as well as his vaunted creativity to building today's program. As we begin this session, we are deeply in his debt, and John is going to come and tell you a little bit about our plans for the Florio section and today's program.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. As we begin the process today of building the Governor James Florio Archive, we think this will be interesting, useful, important, and even fun, and I guess loving too. I wasn't thinking about that word, but it is not without challenges. It's not without challenges. To begin with, we're not setting out to compile an exhaustive history of the actions of every state agency between 1990 and 1994. Our emphasis is on the governor, the training, experience, philosophy, and beliefs he brought to the State House, the decisions he made and the actions he took, the events, initiatives, and responses that shaped those 4 years in New Jersey, and the lessons that Governor Florio's leadership can offer for present and future governors in New Jersey and other states. We all know, however, that a governor very rarely acts alone, so the line between studying governors and studying state government is a blurry one that we expect to redefine periodically as our work proceeds. We also all know that there's rarely a consensus about exactly what happened or why it happened. We hope to be guided by the maximum that's most often attributed to Senator Moynihan, that everyone's entitled to their own facts, but not their own, to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And to compile facts as objectively as we can, but to also record differing points of view about what happened, why it happened, and what might have happened differently. We have the benefit, as Ruth mentioned, of our previous work on the archives of Governor Byrne and Governor Kane, which provide some good building blocks for this endeavor, but also some cautionary notes about not collecting too much information until we know what we're going to do with it and how we're going to organize it. And I expect the Florio Archive to quickly become more useful in some ways and to lead to improvements that we can retrofit back onto those earlier efforts as we move along. We need your continuing help as we go forward with this. We plan to launch the Florio Archive online in January with introductory materials that will include the video of this event and transcript of this event, and then continually to add to it over at least the next 2 years. You may have seen a link to the draft of the website, if that's the right word. Websites have drafts, but a prototype of the website in some of the material we sent before the event. In any case, there's a link to that. The web address is on the first page of the program booklet. And if you have a chance over the next couple of weeks to look at that and let us know what you think of it, we could incorporate your suggestions before we make it live in January or public in January. Much of the important material that will be on the website is in the program booklet, particularly the second half of the booklet. If you look past the bios of the people here today, take the program with you. We'd really ask that you look at that and give us your thoughts about a number of items in that. There's a list of major issues and initiatives from the Florio administration, a beginning list, and already just seeing the draft, Bob Del Tufo, Mike Catania, and Joan Haberly have all sent in things we missed that ought to be added there, and I'm sure there are others that could be stated better. And as we move forward, we're going to look for material that's relevant to all those, or as many of those initiatives as possible. If you look in the booklet, you'll see the bio of Governor Florio, which we compiled from a number of sources. Certainly, if there's anything wrong, let us know, but if there are important facts in there you think we missed and should add, please let us know. There's a timeline in there for the governor's term from 1989 to 1994. There are certainly events that should be added, perhaps some that should be corrected. We'd appreciate that. Going forward, our plan is to have that on the website in some form and to add links to the list of issues and the list of events so that that link it to material from the time and also link it to contemporary analysis that may be relevant to it. So for example, if you look at the timeline, if you're online someday and you look at, or someone is online and they look at the Florio archive and they see that on July 11th, 1991, the governor signed the nation's first living will law, our goal is that you could click on that date and get to a copy of the law and get to press stories about it and perhaps get to video of the bill signing or discussion about it. And then we hope as time goes by that we can add analysis of the law's impact, both through looking at existing works and adding links to that, but also by stimulating new research and writing that people will be drawn to do. Let me add parenthetically, if any of you know anyone who would like to help us move our website to have the capabilities of doing all these things, and either to fund that or help us design it, Jennifer Bogner is our development specialist over there. In the program booklet on the page 21 is our plan, an outline of our plan for creating the Florio archive. Today's event focuses on a number of major issues and significant events, but perhaps for most of them, perhaps for all of them, it will only scratch the surface. We will convene future, more specific and probably smaller sessions on some of these policy areas as well as others. We'll welcome your suggestions about which areas would benefit from such a format and key players or observers who ought to be part of those events. We will also conduct individual interviews with Governor Florio and selected people from within and outside the administration. But we'll try to focus them, perhaps more than we have on our other interviews to date, on the role of the governor and when relevant comparisons with men and women who came before and after, as well as contemporary lessons that can be drawn from that experience. Finally, we seek your help in assembling documents, photographs, and interesting artifacts that we can scan or photograph, as well as relevant video and audio recordings we can add to the website. These can be very useful, instructive, fun to look at in some cases. I ask for them with some trepidation, however. We are not looking to compete with 1-800-GOT-JUNK here. We are not looking to help too many people clean out their basements. If that's an added benefit, that's fine. But we're looking particularly for material where the context is clear, or where you can provide us the context that makes it clear of why this memo is significant or interesting, or who is in this photograph, and when it was taken. And with that caveat, we would welcome that material and be happy to talk to you about any, because I know a lot of you have mentioned that you have some things like that. So thank you for being with us here today, and to those watching or listening or reading transcripts of this at some point in the future, welcome. Let me turn the program back to Ruth. Thank you.
It is true that at a certain point in life, anyone who helps you to clean out your attic or basement is a godsend. And this is a little bit of the history of how the Byrne part of this archive started in Governor and Byrne's and Ruthie's basement. It's now time to present the man at the center of today's program. Certainly in this company, he needs no introduction. And you can find, as John mentioned, a fuller biography of him in your program, but perhaps we could view this entire afternoon as reintroducing him and his legacy, particularly to the wide and enduring universe of cyberspace. While he was governor for only a short time and faced enormous challenges, he was able in those 4 years to have a significant, lasting impact on the state, greater than that of many people who served much longer. Whether or not they agree with him, there's no question today and in all the preceding years since, New Jerseyans respect Governor Florio's knowledge and deep commitment to bettering the state through carefully crafted public policy. No one can doubt his commitment to finding workable solutions to some of the most complex problems we faced then and that we continue to face. Jim Florio served in Congress for 8 terms, authoring or spearheading important environmental legislation and other significant measures before coming back to lead New Jersey when he was elected governor in 1989. In 1993, he received the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, created by the Kennedy family to honor the best public servants. Governor Florio was recognized for, quote, his courageous political leadership in gun control, education, and economic reform. Today, he is of counsel to the law firm of Florio, Perucci, Steinhardt, and Fader, and teaches right here at Rutgers at the Blaustein School. He's a familiar visitor in this room, a valuable contributor to our programs. I'm honored and pleased to welcome back to the Eagleton Institute of Politics, Governor James J. Florio.
Thank you very much. I feel very much like I'm in attendance at my own viewing. Let me first of all extend to all of you Lucinda's regrets for not being able to be here. Just as I mentioned to a few of you, that we have a new puppy. Lucinda last Saturday took the puppy out for a walk. The puppy pulled a hole in the street. She fell into it, and she's all right, but she's got some stitches, and she's got a big black eye, and her ego doesn't allow her. She also reminded me that this is only the second injury that she's had since she's known me. The first one, some of you may recall, at Drumthwacket. I took her out, we played tennis one day, and I put the shot here and then here, to make her run back and forth, and she did, and she broke a bone. She proceeded to enjoy telling everybody that I'm not a particularly good tennis player, but I'm a very aggressive tennis player. And then I had to have staff people send me notes informing me that tennis was not a conflict sport. There's not supposed to be any contact in tennis. But I want to thank everyone for being here. I mean, this is very nice. Nostalgia reigns as I look into the audience and see faces. And I want to also thank everyone at Eagleton for all the hard work they put into making this whole enterprise something that is hopefully of value to the people of the state and the people who do have access to this facility. I want to also express my appreciation for this process and this project forcing me to do something that I really don't do very often, which is to look back. Philosophically, I'm just committed to never looking back because I don't think it's particularly productive. But I've had to do it in this undertaking, and it's been somewhat enjoyable. I mean, I really think we did some fairly important things that I wouldn't have paid attention to if I hadn't been forced to look back as a result of this program. What I thought in my 15 minutes, what I'd do was to just give you some recollections of what I think my mindset was at the appropriate time. That is before the campaign, during the campaign, and then in the transition period that we'll be focusing on today, so as to give you an opportunity and give me an opportunity to see if, in fact, the original intent, at least as it was in my head, was something that we came into compliance with. Things that we did, some of the things we did were good, some of the things didn't work out. But I think it's important to be able to analyze where you were intending to go and where you actually went. And I think the first observation that I'd make is that we did a lot of preparation, much of which was not particularly known. And Carl Van Horn is here, and he was really very helpful to me, actually in the year before we even started the campaign, in having Saturday morning seminars on different topics that we had. Many of them were here at Eagleton, if I recall correctly. And we had 5 or 6 people on the topic of the day: urban policy, transportation, healthcare policy. And some of you were at some of those meetings. And it really enabled us to be very well prepared, not so much for the campaign, because as campaigns become more superficial, you don't need a whole lot of depth to go through a campaign, but to prepare us for initiatives that we became involved with. And that was something that was useful. Greg Lawler's here from that point. He was in Washington, and that was another part of the preparation we had. We appropriately used our authority in Washington to learn more about New Jersey. I had a committee that I was the chairman of, Transportation, Commerce, and Tourism. The commerce component of it allowed us to do everything. And Greg had great relationships, apparently, with the parliamentarian who determined what was the scope of our authority. Commerce gave us the scope of everything. So we had hearings on boxing, we had hearings on all kinds of things. And as you can appreciate, we had these hearings with a definite tilt towards New Jersey. So for boxing, we had the Larry Hazard, who was the boxing commissioner in New Jersey, came and testified. When we did any of the environmental things, we focused on New Jersey Superfund sites. So we had a learning process that allowed us to be able to expand our knowledge base so as to be fairly substantive when we ultimately did come into office. My favorite topic was insurance. That what we had was hearings on insurance, which is interesting because the federal government doesn't have a whole lot of federal jurisdiction over insurance, but through Greg's good art of defining the law and getting the parliamentarian to subscribe to it, we were able to have hearings on automobile insurance in New Jersey and things of that sort. And that was a good, useful exercise as well, getting to interact with people from New Jersey. There were all kinds of people that came up here. Ken Merrin, who's a Republican, who was the Commissioner of Insurance, was very helpful to us in learning the business. And one of the reasons why the insurance industry didn't like us particularly, we knew what we were talking about when we got into office. That was problematic for a whole lot of people in that area. I'd like to just make a couple of observations about some policy matters that we became involved with. And these were matters that were issues that I suspect will be talked about a little bit today. One of the most important ones, of course, was school funding. The school funding we raised through the course of the campaign, but we raised it in a gingerly way. We didn't beat up on people because we made the decision that there wasn't a whole lot of benefit in beating up on the Kane administration because the governor was reasonably popular, and at that point, we didn't need to do it. I observed that, and I had a nice relationship that I developed with Carrie Edwards after we both got out of politics. I was served on the board with him. And I always teased him about how successful he was to sort of rope-a-dope the issue for 8 years, never having any kind of conclusions. And that was very talented. I beat up in the course of the campaign the administration for saying everything was wonderful in all of our cities on the educational front, when it was clearly, objectively, not particularly good. But we were able to get people together to focus on this issue. And when we came into office, we were prepared to deal with education, but not as rapidly. The court decision after 8 years came down a couple of months after we were in office and didn't have a sense that it would cost quite as much as it ended up costing. So that was almost a $2 billion number that we had to deal with. The environmental issues we focused on in our hearings because, as some of you may recall, that summer of 1988-89, the shore was closed. Hypodermic needles, all kinds of toxic waste being washed up, garbage being washed up. And that allowed us to be prepared to go forward very quickly, which we did, with the Clean Water Enforcement Act being passed by the Congress very quickly. The insurance issue was another one that we were prepared to deal with very rapidly when we came into office because we spent so much time preparing for it. The JUA, the Joint Underwriting Association, or whatever it was called, the JUA, which purported to be for bad drivers, was encompassing about 53% of the drivers in the state were in the bad driver fund. So we were able to get that done fairly quickly. As I said, that could cause some animosity, some permanent animosity over the 4-year period with the insurance industry, but it was something we feel was a good thing to do. Two issues that I just wanted to briefly touch on that were not highlighted through the course of the campaign, but by virtue of outside events occurring became fairly important. One was the whole gun issue. There was an event in Stockton, California, where a crazy person took an assault weapon and killed a whole bunch of school children. And then something was a personal event. I went down to Camden, talked to the then prosecutor, Sam Asbell. And I remember being struck by the fact that he told me he couldn't send law enforcement people into North Camden, one of the sections there, at night, because the bad guys had more firepower than the law enforcement people did. And that highlighted the importance for me of dealing with the whole assault weapon issue. I'm not sure if John Lynch was here. I think he was supposed to be. But John Lynch was apprehensive about the issue. And he said not so much on the merits, because, you had to be an idiot not to appreciate the fact we didn't need more Uzis in the state, but on the politics of it. And frankly, with hindsight, he was correct that it was a difficult issue to deal with. Although I will tell you, I think in some respects one of our finest hours was the whole effort, and the successful effort, to be able to beat off the effort of the new legislature that came in to repeal the gun ban. So I'm very proud of that. And then the last issue I would just mention briefly is the fiscal issues, the budgetary issues. I was working off the experience that I had in 1981 when Tom Kane and I competed, and I was challenged because I would not sign a no tax increase pledge, and Tom did. And I teased him a bit. In fact, it took him about 18 months before he violated his no tax pledge, largely under the pressure from Alan Karcher, who was a speaker at the time, who sort of bludgeoned the governor into signing this law. But I still, in our campaign in 1989, refused to sign the pledge, but I copped out a little bit by saying I could foresee no need to do this on the basis of what was represented, but because what was represented was there was a $300 million surplus ending the year that we were finishing, when in fact turned out to be a $600 million shortfall. So right there we were almost $1 billion in the hole, and then the projection for the next year was $2 billion. And then we thought the school district case would come down a little bit later, but it came down very quickly. So anyway, that's just a couple of the thoughts that I had about my mindset going into this whole process. I have insisted upon, and I've been granted, the opportunity to be an ex officio member of all of these panels. So I'll feel no inhibitions about raising my hand at that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The governor is seated strategically at that end of the first row, and will jump in at any point with our encouragement, and I'm sure with your, not simply your tolerance, but your pleasure. The governor's remarks remind me of a conversation that he has with any of us here anytime we talk about this project, this archive, this section of the Center on the Governor, and that is he's not terribly interested in building monuments and statues and nostalgia. He's interested in talking about policy. The policy then related to policy issues now. And as we go forward and, as John indicated, develop more programs under this section, we will be responsive to, respectful of, and care a lot about those, making sure that we present those kinds of programs, and hope that many of you will participate in them as we go forward. I'm now going to present our first panel. Even though the governor has opened with some observations about key policy issues and areas, we're going to talk in this opening session about building the administration, and we're going to begin with the transition. And as we all know, we're fortunate enough to live in a democracy in which, whether we're at the federal level or in the states, we go through orderly transitions, and we're proud of that, and I think, rightly so, and we mention it all the time. But there aren't very many people, maybe everyone else in this room is an exception, but there aren't very many people around who know anything about what that really means. What happens in a transition? What happens? They know what happens right there in front of the cameras, but what happens behind the scenes? What happens between the administration coming in and the outgoing administration? How often is that similar or different? How many outgoing administrations make sure that they burn who knows what and make it difficult for incoming administrations? How many are constructive and generous in the way that they share information and help the there are just all kinds of things we just don't know. And I'm not suggesting that we are now going to find out everything there is to know, but we do think it's very important as part of this section on the Florio administration, and in all the sections on in our Center on the Governor, to focus some attention on the issue of transition. The name of this panel in your program is the Transition, Selecting Staff and Planning for 1990, and you'll find full biographies for the 4 people here. There were really 6 people whose names were always mentioned in connection with transitions. 4 of them are on the panel. Angela Genova is sitting in the audience, and John Shore, I haven't seen John, I don't think he's with us today. But Angelo and John continued in roles that they had during the campaign. The four people sitting here took on different roles in the transition and then moving into the administration. So there's a slight difference in the place they had in the history of this transition. I'm not going to read you their bios, but I'm going to quote, before I turn it over to them, from a newspaper article that appeared in the Star-Ledger on the 9th of November, right after the election, written by Dan Weissman, and in it he quoted the governor-elect in describing each one of the four people here. And we were planning to do this, and I have these quotes, and I will, but I do want to say first that we got this really wonderful gift about an hour ago when Angelo Genova arrived, bearing with him. And this was a surprise, and he gave it to John Weingart, who passed it on to me because of this panel. This is a copy of the Star-Ledger from that very day, and this is the article by Dan Weissman from which I was planning to quote, and I will quote, and we will now have it in our archive. I know you can't see it, even you who are on the panel, but you can later take a look at what you looked like then if you haven't looked at your old photograph albums recently. But everyone on the panel is pictured here, and it's really, I want to thank you very much on behalf of all of us here, and it was great. He explained to me, he can explain it to you later again if he likes, but it had something to do with someone getting a divorce and cleaning out their attic. So that's how we're benefiting with this wonderful artifact.
We want to see the quotes.
I'm gonna read you the quotes, some of the quotes.
Just pass that.
No, you will know if you ever had anything to do with a museum that you don't get to touch artifacts like this without special gloves that curators use, and then they get treated in certain ways. So once you pass through that process, I'll let you touch it. Okay.
Without glasses, we all look the same.
It's with great pleasure that I get this conversation going with these four people, starting over on the other end. Doug Berman, who was, during the administration, the treasurer, during the campaign manager, and he was tasked, according to the governor-elect, and as quoted in this article by Dan Weissman, he was tasked with coordinating the operations in which we will be consciously listening to a wide range of groups and individuals to try to formulate how we will go forward. So, Doug, I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about what that meant then, what it means now, and how it related to any reality at the time. That was his job. Sitting next to him is Steve Persky, the former senator, very distinguished state senator and judge, who joined the campaign when he stepped down from the Superior Court in October, joined the campaign, and became, in the transition, the director of transition. That was his title, and was tasked with, according to the Weissman quote and the governor-elect, Steve's wide range of contacts in and out of government will help assist in organizing the governor's office and supervising the search for top people in the executive branch. So there's a large piece of personnel work there. And Steve is sitting next to Karen. I'll be interested to know later how closely they work together and on this, because Karen Kessler, deputy director of the transition, was tasked, again, according to the Weissman article and Governor Florio's quote, with working with Steve in charge of personnel matters. So these are the two people who were designated as the central point people in bringing the new administration, bringing good people to the new administration. And at the end of the table here, to my right, Brenda Bacon, who was chief of management and planning in the administration overseeing all healthcare and human services reform efforts, and was a senior advisor to the governor during the campaign, well, first of all, in the 81 campaign, worked with that campaign and was a senior advisor. She became, in this effort, the Deputy Director of Transition, tasked with, quote, a review and evaluation of all state agencies, a very important part of what we are doing, the governor-elect said. So I'd like to open this by asking all of you to reflect on how you were described here and what you actually did. And I have this image in my mind, which you may or may not find useful. It was useful to me in thinking about this. It was that there's an old house, a big old house, and it's an important place, and we have lots of important memories associated with it. It's government, it's state government, and now we're going to get a new owner, or really, I thought, no, it's not, it's a new renter. But the renter has to come in and furnish it, organize it, make it ready for the day when the family moves in, when people move in. And so your job was to take this old house in Trenton and to prepare it for moving in day. And we want to hear about what each of you learned about the role you had to do and how you did it. And I'm going to go down to Doug, and then we can come forward.
Well, first, I'm really excited to be here. It's so great to see so many old friends. I haven't been involved in government or politics for a long time. I just want to say that, I've always, it's like being back on the campaign trail. I just wish there were people in government today like you, Governor. Be a lot better for America. I'm going to vary a little bit from what you asked. The transition...
Not permitted.
It's relevant, though, and it echoes what the governor said. Governor ran his campaign on a couple of issues. One, the environment. We talked about clean water and appointing an environmental prosecutor. And we didn't vary from that very often. We talked about the importance of dealing with crime. And that had two messages. He was for the death penalty, and we would get rid of assault weapons. We said we had to fix the insurance problem. There was a $4 billion deficit that the state had to deal with because of how we were dealing with car insurance, and we said we would fix it. And then, as he said, we finessed the issue of what we thought might happen with respect to the budget. We had looked long-term. The $1.8 billion surplus that had been growing during the Kane administration had shrunk to $300 million because spending was no longer tracking with revenues, and that trend was going to cross itself, but that they had begun to use the savings account to cover the bills. And it was very committed to policy. We had the good fortune by mid-September to be in the lead, and I remember turning to the governor one night in the office and saying, "Can you really fix the insurance thing? I mean, is this for real?" And he said, "Yes." And I know that early on we asked Greg and Rick Wright, already in the campaign, to begin to formulate that, because the governor believed in an administration in which it was going to be about policy. And we knew early on that it wasn't just about who was going to sit in what places, but be it Carl, Scott, Angelo, Brenda, who was down the hall in the office. We had already begun to think about how we were going to get the policies the governor was advocating that would be better for the people of New Jersey through. And so when we talk about the transition, I had written him a memo still during the campaign that said, look, we're going to have a budget problem. If we don't do the insurance thing first, this big promise that you have made to the people, we will never get to do, because the budget will consume it. And so that was the first substantive topic that I think Steve early on had to start to think about how he will get through the legislature, and Jamie and others, but that, and then Greg and Rick Wright. we kind of made a decision that, and I hope the legislative guys follow the same thinking, but that we would do insurance, we would do the gun bill, because that was going to be really tough and a big fight, and then we would deal with the fiscal matters that we thought were coming down the pike. But from the beginning of the administration, I think we were thinking about assignments and responsibilities in terms of executing and getting past the policies that the governor had been talking about throughout the campaign, and believed there had to be a consistency between what he had campaigned on and what we did when we actually got into government. And so a lot of it had already begun, right? When I have a kind of view of politics that says there's three kinds of things that affect what happened. The externalities, right? Things you don't control overall that happen, like a recession. There are other actors, the legislature and other people, and then your own actions that are both good and bad in the context of trying to get things done. As the governor suggested, 3 days before the end of the campaign, Governor Kane got up and said there's a $300 million surplus. The very first briefing with OMB, 3 days after, is I was becoming the state treasurer and thinking, well, I'm going to try to do what the governor asked, reach out. And they say, well, it might not be $300 million, it might be zero. About 2 weeks later, well, it might be $200 million in the current year. Until, slowly as the transition between the OMB reporting to the Kane administration and the OMB reporting to the Florio administration, those numbers became $600 million in the current year, and then $2.5 billion without the school problem in the upcoming year. And I'm going to let others talk about it, but a key part as we come back to talk about the transition is a lot of efforts that were beginning to be dealt with, some never, I don't think, public to this day, to what to do about that $600 million before we even took office. But let me start there and let others talk.
Steve, you went on to become chief of staff in the administration, but
I haven't figured that out yet. But yes.
But you had another role in the transition, and how did that happen?
I'm not sure. Let me first express my appreciation as well. Those of you who do have dogs, other than the governor, know something about the concept that 1 year in a dog's life is equivalent to 7 years in human life, something like that. I spent 366 days in this effort, and I really want to express how deeply I appreciate the opportunity to revisit the delights and the joys of those 366 days. When I remember them, I'll let you know. As far as the transition process is concerned, it's all these years later, and there's still some things I haven't been able to figure out. The short story, and I'll try to keep it short, is that this started, I was sitting as a Superior Court judge. I had known then Congressman Florio for a long time. We had served in the Assembly together before he went to Congress. We managed, through the assistance of mutual friends, to have some conversations, and it was clear to me that I would be afforded, if I wanted it, and I did, the opportunity, if he were elected, to come in and play a role in the governor's office, which, for a variety of reasons, intrigued me, particularly because I knew, as did everybody else who worked with him before he was elected, that he was principally focused on policy, and there were some critically important policy determinations that were about to be made. But as a Superior Court judge, of course, I could not be in any way involved in the political process. So we arranged, again with the assistance of one particular mutual friend, for me to do some homework and some research through unsigned memoranda that went back and forth to him with respect to how the governor's office should be organized, what his thoughts were, my research. As we went through the spring of 1989 and during the primary season, I got more involved with it. At one point, I actually was in Trenton, incident to my own reappointment, and spent some time there that day with the assistance of a friend of mine in the Legislative Services Office, getting all of the documents from the Kane transition and even some from the original Byrne transition to do some additional homework. And all of that, in my mind, was fine. I was planning on doing all of this, giving some suggestions for how the office should be organized, and planning to stay on the bench until after the election, where I was nice and safe. And then sometime, I think it was early in July, the governor, I'm going to call him the governor, he wasn't then, called me and said, I got a problem. What's your problem? Well, a lot of people on my staff are being critical of me because as far as they know, I'm not giving any thought to what happens after the election. You and I both know that's not so, but I am not able, for obvious reasons, to share that with anybody. So we decided that it would be okay with both of us if he assigned somebody to come down and see me and to get all of the materials that I had already collected, which by that time included some materials from the staff. I remember Scott Wiener had done a memo and some others. So he sent a fellow down to see me one day by the name of Angelo Genova, whom I had not previously known. And Angelo and I worked it out so that all of whatever wisdom I thought I had was given to him, and he took, as far as everybody else in the operation was concerned, he took responsibility for a very low level, a very low key effort to design and organize the administration at the beginning. And that was also fine with me. I still planned on staying on the bench until November. And then someplace, I want to tell you, it was around the middle of September, it wasn't working. And it wasn't working because by the middle of September, there wasn't anybody in the state of New Jersey who didn't know who the next governor was going to be. And that meant that there was even more pressure to get rather specific in terms of not only what the structure of the governor's office would be and how it would be organized, but rather who would be filling what kinds of roles, and the situation became untenable. And therefore, I was invited to join the campaign on October the 3rd or 4th of the year as, I forget what name I was given. It didn't matter. It wasn't intended to fool anybody, and it didn't. Everybody knew what my role was going to be. I do, by the way, remember, I don't know if you do, that at the time that I did step down and it got whatever news it got, Governor Florio was 16 points ahead in the polls at that stage. He wound up winning by 20 points, and as I made clear to Doug at the time, those 4 points were on account of me. My original expectation through this entire process, the governor and I had never had a specific conversation as to exactly what role I would be playing. We both concluded that it would be best to leave that to be evolved by circumstance. But in my own mind, I contemplated that the best thing for me and the best way I could be helpful would be in the position of counsel to the governor, where I could assist both in the shaping of policy and in the direct dealings with the legislature, which was where I'd had obviously 11 years of experience. And most of the legislators, including most of the senior legislators, were people that were very well known to me. Somewhere along the way, and I have never figured it out, I really haven't, and I don't know the answer today, maybe somebody else does. Somewhere along the way, that got morphed into my becoming the chief of staff. And then I recruited Jack Sweeney to serve as counsel to the governor. My principal role in the pre-election process, in the month between when I stepped down and the election, I set up a small office in Atlantic City, about 1/5 the size of this room, where I wound up entertaining a variety of applicants for a variety of opportunities. Some of them were candidates in their own minds for cabinet positions. Some were the staff, some of whom are in this room, who I invited so that I could become informed, first of all, so that I could meet some of them. Some of them I didn't know. Many of them I didn't know. But I was kind of taking inventory. What do you want? What are you looking to do? Do you want to be inside or do you not want to be inside? If you want to be inside, what kind of a role do you contemplate for yourself? And I had that discussion with a great many people. After the election, my principal focus initially was, again, internal. And when I say internal, I mean in the structure of the governor's office. I had learned by that time how the governor wanted to operate. Different leaders, different executives operate in different fashions. Some prefer a pyramid structure. My conclusion was that this governor was going to prefer what I always called a spokes and wheel concept, where he was at the center and had direct interaction with a variety of people rather than have it structured. So we designed that, and my principal focus during the early part of the transition was again on the internals. John Shore, of course, was the obvious choice for press. We needed a legislative liaison. I found somebody that I didn't know that I wish now I had known earlier, because she's that talented, sitting right in front of me, Diane Quinton, and the various other positions that would structure the governor's office. One of the principal ones was the position of Director of Policy and Planning. Governor one day called me in and said, I need you to go see Brenda Bacon. Why should I go see Brenda Bacon, who I really did not know at that point, because I want her to be in here and she's not all that enthused yet. So I went down and had lunch with Brenda Bacon and spent some time explaining to her why it was so important that she join the effort and assume that responsibility. And when we got all finished, she looked at me and she said, you know, you sound just like him. Which I then and today take as a compliment. You asked the question about Karen. Karen was an integral part of everything that we were doing. Her focus, at least as far as I was concerned, was more external than my focus. She was out there finding names and candidates and possibilities for a wide range of policy and substantive positions, whereas at least at the beginning, I was focused more on process and structure. As far as the legislative piece is concerned, we'll leave that for the remaining part. I agree with exactly what Doug said. We had a very specific agenda. My recollection is on the night of the election, the principal, if not the sole, policy statement that the governor-elect made that night was on auto insurance. That was going to be focus number one, and indeed it was, and with the cooperation of the legislative leadership, from whom you'll hear in a little while, that was accomplished. We then turned to the guns. I'll have some more to say about that later. That was the longest day of my life, and the rest of it went from there.
He actually stated, according to the press, that it was the automobile insurance and a smooth transition.
Right,
so those were the two.
Right, the only policy or substantive focus, that my recollection is that night, was we're going to do auto insurance, and that indeed was the job from day one.
I just want to ask you a follow-up because of something you said, and it would be a question I would have asked later, and other people can comment on it later. But how often did that happen during this transition? That is, the governor-elect himself calling you or others and saying there's a certain person. I mean, how involved was the governor-elect himself? And certainly he can speak to it now too as well.
Yeah, I don't think that was more than once an hour. As I recall it.
So Brenda, I'm sorry you weren't singular in this.
If the election was on Tuesday, which I think it was, it would have been Thursday before he said to me, knowing my background, obviously, as his, that we would both see the Attorney General as being in any structure, a very important part of the building process. He said to me, you know Bob Del Tufo? I'm sure I do. I've known Bob Del Tufo for a long time. Go tell him I want him to be Attorney General. So I called Bob Del Tufo, who was 3 blocks down the street, and we had dinner. And
he eats after we've all
and Bob Del Tufo became Attorney General. I mean, the governor was, or the governor-elect was intimately involved in at least everything I was touching. He knew everything I was doing. He would obviously direct me in some instances and in general terms, or some instances as that in rather specific terms. But he was certainly very intimately involved in every, not necessarily in the second level, or what I would call second level assistance in the structure of the governor's office, But certainly, with respect to all of the cabinet choices, absolutely.
So you would say that that would be pretty much the pattern, that he guided you to most of the top appointments. He had that in mind already.
Not
Then-
necessarily.
Some.
Not necessarily. Yeah. Not
Okay.
exactly. Not necessarily. Attorney General, he knew who he wanted.
Right.
Treasurer, he knew who he wanted.
DEP, he knew who he wanted.
DEP, he knew who he wanted. But there were a whole range of other very important
Right.
positions. Also, George, what did we?
Zoffinger.
George Zoffinger.
Commerce.
But there were a lot that he met for the first time after we had met them.
Absolutely. Karen, who will speak for herself, brought in a number of candidates for a number of positions. And obviously, at the end of the day, the choice was not any of ours. I do remember one instance, we were looking for an environmental prosecutor. And at one of our morning meetings, at some point in this guy, and there would have been 8 or 10 of us, I guess, in the room, whatever. And he said, okay. He said, how many people in here, show of hands, know who I'm going to appoint as environmental prosecutor? And I didn't raise my hand. I had no clue, because it wasn't part of what I was doing. I assume Karen probably did, or whoever. In any event, a couple of hands went up, 1 or 2, and kind of a puzzled look. What's that about? And he said, I just want to know who to blame if it gets out before I'm ready to announce it. So if your question is, was he intimately involved in the important pieces of this? Oh, I'd say yeah.
It was not, yeah. It was delegated out, but also actively engaged. I'm going to let you speak for yourself, Karen, and say that you were described and have been described as a talent scout in this process. Personnel is what I quoted before, but as someone who could be a talent scout in the big world out there for the governor-elect. So if you want to start from there,
Sure.
talk about
Well,
when you got involved, how you got involved, and what you did.
I had a few different roles. We'll start like this. I'd come from private industry, and I became Jim's director of finance during the campaign, thanks to Doug Berman calling me. I was on maternity leave, and he felt that he probably didn't have to pay me for the first 4 months since I was being paid by my employer. So that's how I got this job. And I ended up staying on as the finance director. I never had any thought that I was going to go into state government. That wasn't my rhythm. That wasn't what I loved. So I, in many ways, was an easier choice because I wasn't competing for any of these jobs. We raised a lot of money during the campaign, and a lot more than had ever been raised before. And when we hit about $10 million and we started buying sweatshirts for the campaign staff, we knew we sort of had hit the amount of money we needed. And short of raising excess of money, I remember sitting with Doug and saying, I think we're done. I mean, it's September, but I don't really think we need a lot more money. And I really thought at that point I was going to go back to my life in New York, and that was going to be. And instead, I remember going to see Jim, and most times when I said I needed time on his schedule, he would roll his eyes because he knew he had to fundraise, which was always his least favorite activity, and probably still is to this day. And I remember walking in and saying, I think I'm done. I think we've raised enough money. I don't think we need to do this anymore. And he, at that point, said to me, what about starting to work on transition? And I remember going in the elevator by myself and letting out this squeal and saying, damn it, he really knows we're winning this thing. I mean, we'd never said it out loud that we were going to win that early. So my first responsibility, or the way we first approached it, was with Kurt Shadle, who was working with me, is we called the Democratic Governors Association in Washington. And we went because there really was no internet to speak of in a big way. And we went to Washington and we got their manuals on how to put together a transition and came back with sort of all these materials. And we started looking through them. And then I called Ed McGlynn. And I remember feeling like I was in a secret covert spy operation because I was so afraid he was going to call the Ledger and say that, who was this arrogant campaign that was picking up the phone. And I said, could I meet with you? And I went to meet with him. And I said, I need the floor plans. I need to see the office sizes. I need to talk to you about where we're going to set up transition. Remember? And we came back sort of with all this material. And at that point, Jim had said to me, I need you to go meet with this guy named Steve Persky. And I went to meet with Steve. I'd never met him before. And sort of said, here's all the stuff I have. And we began to sort of divide up. So it was everything from, office space and who was going to get it and how many floors we needed. And it was probably, which will be humorous to those that watch it from years from now, the first email campaign. We all were introduced to email during the campaign. None of us had it before. So when we started transition, and within 4 seconds of getting named to our jobs, the world wanted to find all of us. some of it came in through email, and every day when the mail was delivered, that was like the big rush. And I had a few jobs. One job was, getting all these letters from people who gave us lists of everyone who had to be fired within 5 minutes from the Kane administration. And there were a lot of people that made sure we knew who they were. We had one group of people who made sure of everybody who had, a year and a half left till they got their pension. Please, can't they stay? Come on, please, please. So that was sort of another list that we had to sort of sort through. We had a lot of those. We had a lot of people, particularly people from South Jersey, who felt that this was our time, and so therefore most of those jobs should go to people from South Jersey. A lot of people who felt there should never be anyone hired who was not a New Jersey resident. But the governor was very clear to us and said, I'm looking for the best. That's what I'm looking for. And I don't care where they're from, and I don't care how you find them. I'm looking for the best. We did not hire a search firm, although we talked about that for a while because we felt it was going to add time to the process and money to the process. So we started our own networks, and we called, and we found an education commissioner in Texas, and we found a transportation commissioner in Colorado. And whether they were from Colorado or whether they were from Collingswood, it really didn't make a difference to Jim. It was who was the best. We brought them in if they had a track record. We brought them in if we thought they had the kind of personality that was going to work with him, someone who was going to be a hard worker, someone who was going to sort of get the whole policy. The cabinet was really a different kind of search than then when we started going to the next levels. That's where we started looking at an awful lot of people that we knew, people who we knew were hard workers, people who had track records, people who we thought we could get along with people. And then there were always those stories, which I know I told you over the phone, that my most favorite was we got a letter from a state senator extolling the virtues of someone for Jeff Connor's job for the banking commissioner, which was one of the last positions that we filled, telling us how fabulous this candidate was, and the candidate was CC'd at the bottom, and at the top was a sticky, and it said, please ignore this letter. And there was a real introduction into sort of all the forces coming together at once. Our job was to be gracious. Our job was to always remember it wasn't us who was elected. It was Jim Florio who was elected. Our job was to sort of represent him and serve him well, to not act as if this was all about us. But it was also to learn how to say no graciously and sometimes how to say no directly. So.
Questions. So there was never a headhunting firm in York. And the other transitions, I think Governor Kane's transition, there was the use.
They must have had more money than we did.
We
didn't. I think it was.
What do you mean? You had enough money in September?
We talked about it. I mean, first of all, the transition had a budget. That was the first thing.
She's right. We talked about it, and we decided that given what we had already going for us, we didn't need it. And Karen filled that role. I mean, I remember going to see Ed Koch, who was at that time was just going out of office in New York City, because we had some common. Some people that worked for him had worked for me and whatnot. And do you have any names that you would like us to take a look at? And indeed, some of them did come into the process.
I would say there were only two people that, in that year, in the year that the governor was elected, we were one of two national elections. There was a lot of attention paid to us, particularly because some of the issues that the governor was dealing with. So we had, from my purposes, we had a fundraising base all over the country. We had people that were giving to us from all over. We had prominent people calling out and reaching out to help us. So it really wasn't that hard to establish a national talent bank of people who were willing to go out and look for us. And as I said, the governor had probably half the cabinet pretty much in place before as he was elected. He knew who he wanted for some of those roles. There were the other roles that we really had to go out for. And then once we got below that, we really pretty much stuck to New Jersey folks anyhow.
But when you brought in someone from Texas or from Colorado, if it
was
someone the governor didn't know, how did that happen?
We sat in a hotel lobby in New York and we would cycle them through. I mean, how did we find them?
No, once you found them, then you brought them in, and before
they
met him.
Well, Steve and I would meet with them, and we would talk for a while. We would do, probably now it's somewhat rudimentary background searches, but we did as best we could then. I remember we would call Angela and make sure that they'd done nothing, too horrific in their background, that they showed up in some federal register somewhere. And then when we felt we had somebody who, on a lot of levels, was going to work, we would say to the governor, we've got a couple people we want you to talk to about transportation, even though we pretty much could call it because we knew him well enough to know who he was going to really like at that point.
But we never even dreamed about the notion that we would settle on a candidate for a given position and then tell him about it.
Never.
That was not right. Going to happen.
It's just that it sounds very direct, very energetic, and having served on more than I can tell you academic search committees, this sounds like a model of effectiveness for how a search might take place for high-level
Just
positions.
to
Yes,
share an
Governor.
insight with you that I think is significant. I mean, the two weakest places in the whole cabinet were as a result of people from out of state. Texas on education, South Carolina, I think, on health. And good people, good credentials, whatever, just didn't understand the toxic nature of New Jersey politics and were not able to do it. But I thought that was an interesting insight, that those folks who came in highly credentialed just could not adjust to New Jersey politics in the education field and in the healthcare field.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There was another question. Well, I'm going to let Brenda go, and then I'll come back with some of it. But a question about whether you actually talked about categories. We need to have some Republicans. We do. You talked about South Jersey, the ethnicity issue, the gender issue. I know that there were women's organizations by that point, some of which we had to do with organizing resumes and sending them in to make sure there was that sensitivity. So I just wonder what happens inside in talking about those kinds of issues. But I want to go to you, Brenda. You were tasked, according to what I quoted before, with reviewing all the state agencies and coming up with what?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to see we've all mellowed to the same degree that the governor has. We were a very policy-driven group of people, as is apparent, and still are. And I think that one of the things that was important for us to do is to figure out whether we could get these policies done. I mean, the governor was very focused on not just having the policy, but getting it implemented, making it happen. And in order to make policy happen, you have to certainly have people in those agencies and departments who are willing to get that done. And as we all know in state government, there are many people who have been there for many years, who have seen administrations come and go and could care less what your bright new idea is. And so we spent a lot of time looking at these different agencies and the different departments and their mid-level leadership beyond the commissioner, because you can certainly bring in the commissioner, but who else is there and what else, were they willing to work with us, did they believe? And many people in state government, unfortunately, because they've been there so long, don't believe anymore. You know, they don't believe you can really get it done, and we really believed we could do these things. And we certainly had an agenda, you know, taking on a lot of issues in a very short period of time. You know, so we took on the insurance lobby, the gun lobby, we had tax reform, education, healthcare, everything. So in trying to hit all of those things and looking out on that landscape, there was a lot of work to be done in terms of who we wanted to implement this. I think probably the area that we could have done better on was listening. You didn't know who to listen to, you know. And no transition is easy. There's no such thing as being able to plan and have an orderly transition. I think the Kane administration was very good in sharing information, but you do a transition usually once. You don't keep doing transitions, and so once you get good at it, you know, it's kind of over. And I think at that point we didn't know who to listen to and who not to listen to. I'd look out at Kathy Karate and say, I wish we'd listened a little bit more to you on a lot of things. I can say that now. We wouldn't have said that then. You know, we were like, we had the idea. So I think that because we were so idealistic, so determined, so aggressive, that we may have missed some opportunities, perhaps in some of the government agencies and some of the departments, to get people more bought in to what we wanted to do.
Do you want to share anything that you wish you'd listened to her about?
I think probably learning some of the wisdom of Trenton, such as it is. I also came from the private sector and went into government, which is, in fact, I didn't know I was going into government until the governor announced it in the paper. And so, it is, you know, usually if you're in the private business, if you set a goal and you get the people working on it and you know where you're going, it happens. And government doesn't happen that way. And I think in Trenton also, there was a lot of emphasis on power rather than policy. And even though people may have believed in the policy, they would never admit it if their role in the power structure and the credit of getting that policy done was not where they thought it should be. And I think perhaps we didn't understand that as much as we could have, or as anybody would have as a new administration coming in. And in retrospect, some of the, when Kathy would say, well, gee, so-and-so tried to do that, and this is what happened, and this legislator doesn't like that, and this, you can't get it through this way, go this way. And we were like, oh, no, we're going this way. Okay? And that proved to be an issue for us, a challenge.
I agree with Brenda that if the single biggest mistake in the first part was not spending enough time, not just with the legislature, but available kind of just where you had a cup of coffee, right? We had a lot of things to get done. Needless to say, back to some of the things on the agenda, I was allowed to staff the Treasury. I mean, the governor had told me I was going to inherit this again before the end of the campaign. I had started to think about how to deal with this large bureaucracy. There were a lot of key jobs that we're going to need to get tough counsel on really quickly that I could rely on, so I could talk to Steve, Brenda, and then ultimately the governor about the budget and a lot of the other issues that were going to be on. Thinking that I should go over and have a cup of coffee and just sit there in the morning I hadn't been of Trenton, and in hindsight that would have been a really valuable set of time, not that I think that I had the time. And the other thing is I don't think we appreciated the second transition that was going on, but Speaker Doria and Wayne Bryant were also transitioning into the majority for the first time in a long time. Right. And so all of what was going to happen between how the two houses were interacting and how they were going to organize themselves and what that was going to be like, we didn't have a sensitivity to. And I think internally, the best person we had who was perhaps able to tune into it if he had the time had been tasked to organize the governor's office and recruit everyone else. So that Steve, who we all assumed would be that conduit, didn't have the time to say, hey guys, you got to go see these people, or we got to go talk to them. And that, we got a lot done, but it came at a kind of, tension level to making it happen that perhaps was greater than needed in the urgency of moving ahead.
Two things. First,
Yeah.
I want to subscribe to that. That's the conclusion I've drawn all these years later, that from a policy and substantive point of view, 22 years or 21 years after the fact, I don't apologize for anything. I think if they had let it alone, just close your eyes and imagine where New Jersey would be today financially and from every other perspective if what we had done in those years had been left to grow. So from a substantive and a policy point of view, and from a tactical point of view, in terms of the fact that between the November election and the June 30th budget date, as you'll hear later this afternoon, look at everything that we were able to accomplish. We meaning we and the legislature were able to accomplish. But we sowed the seeds of our own failure in there through what Doug is talking about. We solved a lot of people's problems before they knew they had a problem. And then it became necessary after the fact to say, well, if we hadn't done this then, and that's not, in political terms, that argument does not then, did not then, does not now resonate. The other point I wanted to make, you asked today and you asked in the papers that you circulated the other day, in the selection process or in the identification of candidates process, did we have what, you should forgive me, I'm going to use my word, not yours, did we have any quotas? Were we looking for women? Were we looking for geography? Were we looking for race? And the answer that because I thought about it once you asked it the other day, and I have no recollection of any conversation of that nature. I think a lot of it was because in the natural process, we wound up touching a lot of bases without doing it in that way. For example, Judy Askin became the Commissioner of Environmental Protection not because she was a woman, but because of a whole lot of other reasons. And there she was, nevertheless, as a woman in charge of one of the most important departments in the government. And similarly with other people, what you might otherwise have wanted to artificially look for kind of filled itself in. But I don't remember ever sitting down and say, hey, gee, we're we're really short on this or we're really short on that.
It's not, I was not asking it, I don't actually speak very much about quotas. I don't like the word very much. I wasn't asking it from that perspective.
You didn't use the word, I did.
I was asking it more from the perspective of this was a time, was well into already, a time when we had all become, it was a part of our conversation in politics and in government. How do we make changes in our democracy in recruiting those who govern, whether it's to run for office or serve in appointed positions or whatever, where there's more of a mix than there had been in the past in all sorts of ways. So partly that's ideological or a sense of change, evolution of the democracy. Partly it's very political. There's a reason to say, I mean, Karen's the one who said, well, South Jersey or whatever it is,
Well,
responding
we did a
to.
lot
So
of
I was just
outreach.
interested if it was in your thinking.
We did outreach. I mean, no one ever said, you know, we're low on this, we're high on this, be careful. There was none of that kind of discussion ever. But we definitely did outreach. And I remember one story, I'm going to forget the guy's name too, but I remember we got, we did outreach to the Bar Association. And within the Bar Association, there were different subgroups. And I remember the Hispanic Bar Association came to us with a candidate that they wanted us to consider just head the kosher fraud unit. Do you remember that? And you know, we weren't getting we weren't getting a whole lot of traction on the job, frankly. And so, you know, when we get this application and the Hispanic bar says this is a candidate we really want to advance, and I'm thinking, why? Like, why would this matter? And sure enough, he was a Puerto Rican Orthodox Jew schloyer who really wanted this job. And I remember saying, bingo, we got him. I mean, it was like done. We didn't have a lot, you know, because there wasn't a lot. But
We
so
would have had to have invented him if he didn't.
So there were a few like that, but basically we did do. I mean, part of my job really was to with the people that were working with me was to do that outreach as well. It's not just to wait to see what came in over the transom, although there certainly was a lot of that, but it was also to pick up the phone and call some of the organized talent banks that were out there that existed and say, you know, we're looking to fill a number of positions in government. Who do you have and who would be interested in? And that is how we found some of the folks.
Let me, it just occurs to me in this context to tell a story that I have solicited and achieved permission, specific permission to tell, because it kind of is a little bit related to this. Shortly after we got started, because the only reason I know that is because we were already in the governor's office, it was obvious that we needed to have a staff behind me. We needed a deputy chief of staff, and a number of people were recommending a fellow that I had not met at that point, but knew very well by reputation, by name of Jamie Fox. So I went to see Jamie, or he came to see me, or whatever, and we met each other, and it was obvious, at least to me from the very beginning, that this was a fabulous candidate to do what we needed. So we brought him in, and as it was required at that time, of course, we sent his name and resume over to the state police for the required background investigation, known then as the four-way, probably still is. But before we got it back, Jamie was already across the office doing his thing. And at some point, a couple of weeks later, whatever it was, I get a call from the superintendent of state police, who Jamie then and now refers to as J. Edgar. And he says, I've got to come see you. Remember, this is January, February 1990. You have to understand that because you'll see. Anyway, I got to come see you. Well, superintendent of state police is calling me with a problem. So he comes over. What's the problem? He said, well, we did the background on this guy Fox. Yeah. And he says, well, he says, I mean, you know, everything's fine. He says, there's no obvious, you know, but he's very. He says, what's the matter? We think he may be gay. And my exercise, of course, at that point was to keep a straight face, which was probably the most difficult thing I've ever done in the governor's office. And I don't even remember what I said to him. Something to the effect of, well, we'll check it out, or I don't even know. Because I couldn't wait to get him out of the office so that I could run across the hall. Jamie, guess what? There's so much for for both.
I'm so glad we have that for posterity.
I did ask him if I could tell the story.
Doug, I'm going to let you make that comment, and then we did begin a little late, so we're running a little late on this, but I do want to we promised 10 minutes to people to add to.
If I may, just to point out.
Wait, you must say, for the record, and I didn't read
I'm
this
Jamie
before.
Foxx.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to say that 30 days later, Clint Pagano forced me to retire.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
The sensitivity that you're thinking about, I just want to say, was from the day the governor started, we were just different than prior years, right? Jean Holtz and her Dave then were the first two people in this little conference room from day one. When the governor first asked me to kind of start putting the campaign together, we took a conference room in the law firm I was part of. But senior women, I mean, Karen, Brenda, Sharon out there were integral to the campaign from the very beginning, Emma. So it was just natural. And the only thing that made a difference, I can't speak because Karen and Steve did the administration, but as I was thinking about just the governor, the treasurer's office, I would just push for more candidates. The issue is it's easy to come forward with everybody who everybody thinks. We recruited Bob. You were in the city, right? When we recruited you back to head the Office of Technology for the government. And it was making sure that they looked before they just said, yeah, okay. And that was part of it. Didn't mean they'd get the job, but you knew that you wanted to see a wide range of candidates.
Good, thanks for adding that. As I said, we started a little bit late, but we want, with all of these sessions, since, as I said at the beginning, it's really a community interview. So this was brief, but focused on that issue of transition. I would invite people now who'd like to add something to that. And also, there were quite a number of things, of course, I didn't get to ask you. I mean, and some that you mentioned, what really worked very well, what would you advise others, how did what you did in the transition process have a positive impact on governments and so forth. So some of those and anything else that people would like to put on the record about the transition stage, the process and the stage, we'd really appreciate if you'd add now. And again, I have to repeat because this is being recorded and we must have your name for transcribers, and even though everyone knows you in the room, Angelo Genova, please say it into the microphone.
Angelo Genova. This is kind of in the nature of a question more than a comment, but the context for the transition was 1989, coming off of 8 years of a Republican administration, Republican-controlled legislature. And my recollection is that there was a great deal of pressure and tension between the policy objectives in the administration and the New Jersey political establishment at the time, having expectations. Can you comment on how you dealt with those and balanced the governor's policy agenda with the proliferation of interest coming from various places, party leaders and the like, that the transition be responsive to a party that was out in the wilderness for 8 years?
Well, I think that the fact that we were able to do what we did in the first 6 months of the administration answers the question. That, for the reasons Doug has indicated, there were some problems under the surface that we never managed eventually to get on top of, is true. But the fact is that we were able to work the agenda with the leaderships in the legislature with differing degrees of enthusiasm, to be sure. And the speaker can speak to this himself, but the fact is the obvious. If we weren't able to have made the accommodations and arrangements that we were able to make eventually, the leaderships, we wouldn't have gotten anything passed. And the fact is that we got 41 and 21 on every initiative that we set out to do. It cost us a lot. Eventually, it cost him more than any of us. But we got the 41 and 21 every time.
But I guess my question, Steve, is I'll use the patronage piece.
Right.
That's
I
what
was
my
going
question.
to say there were more people in New Jersey that had that red book that I think had a phone book at that time. Everybody had the red book. Everybody already had highlighted pages of where they thought they belonged and who belonged on what commission. And every county leader and every Democratic person we ever ran into and everybody who ever gave us a nickel to the campaign, everybody had sort of their wish list. And we got a lot of them. And some of them were so incredibly inappropriate that, we would, in the privacy of the office, we would say, can you believe? We would get a letter. There was a great one, and I won't say who, of a person who wrote, hey, really wanted to be Attorney General. And this is why I should be Attorney General. And it was like 14 things. And then it said, and if I can't, I need an exchange at the corner of Route 1 and 9 for my client who needs a variance for a gas station. We're like, are you kidding me? But there was everything and anything in between. Everybody felt they should have gotten a job. Everybody said to us the same thing. Tom Kane cleaned house the minute he came in from Brendan Byrne. Don't you leave those people in for 1 minute. Those were entitled. All the old Byrne people who felt that it was their jobs that were sort of wrested from them, that they wanted back in. All the people that were new, that had sort of been part of the campaign that wanted back in. There was
every day.
There was every day.
8 days a week.
It was intense, and how do you balance it? You balance it the best way that you can. Fortunately, there's an awful lot of appointments to boards and commissions, which is really not what most of them wanted, but those were was an option. We kept records, we kept tracking, we sort of did our version of Excel spreadsheets that existed in those days, and sort of said we'll be back to you. And in the end, you had to sort of say, if you make a cut, you got to make it for quality, and let the chips fall where they were. And we were really fortunate because we were working for a guy who felt that way from the get-go and who never felt any way other than that, and who always would say to me, in particular, because I had been the fundraiser, did that guy ever I didn't know that guy gave us money. Jim had not a clue who was his fundraisers, so it wasn't a question of making them happy because he didn't know who they were to begin with.
I think we had a lot of information coming at us, not only from people who wanted jobs, but also policy. There are a lot of people who had a great idea that for 8 years nobody would listen, and they thought this is the way to fix that, this is the way to fix this. So you had a lot of data coming in, and to your point of people being out of power for 8 years. And I think a lot of pressure also personnel-wise, you said this before, from South Jersey, because South Jersey had never had an opportunity, they felt, to be equally considered for leadership positions. So there was a lot of pressure coming from there as well.
Ruth, I know we're short on time, but this is the story
Western South Jersey.
Sets up, to me, one of the great contrasts between people who think he was a great governor and then Jim Florio, that unfortunately led to a lot of the choices that then we had to make over the 6 months. We knew there was a yawning budget deficit. So did the people in the Kane administration who dealt with finance. And there was a plan to raise the sales tax immediately during the week when Governor Kane was still governor and the new Democratic state legislature was going to take office.
Correct.
In order to push off the issues around school funding, because the sales tax increase was all that was really needed to get the budget through. And you can put a sales tax increase into effect in basically a month. It would have greatly reduced the deficit in the fiscal year we were inheriting and really solve the problem going forward. And the details of that bill were resolved at the staff level. Governor had been briefed. I believe Steve had briefed the Democratic leadership to some degree that this was going on. Steve, myself, and the governor went up to Drumthwacket to see, I know it was Feather, I forget who the other person, I think the governor's...
I think it was Debbie Porter.
Right, no, it was the governor's chief of staff, I think, and Governor Kane. His two staff people were urging him to do it, and he looked us in the eye, he said he wouldn't do it. An act of political courage, cowardice for what was best for the state of New Jersey, because he didn't want to ever be seen as raising taxes. And the legacy of that lives on. And I asked Steve, because I was pretty sure he was the other person in the room with me and the governor on our side, and that unfortunately set so many other decisions in motion, because coming out of the campaign and as being the kind of political strategist as well as coming in to take the budget, we knew that communications and how all of this was going to play out would be tremendously important long term, which was why we were starting with the car insurance. And the hope was long term to let the decision we all assumed was coming down from the Supreme Court come down later, not have to deal with it right away, but hold hearings around the state. Let the issue develop so that you could resolve the income tax and use that down the road and solve the budget thing a different way. And because, right, Governor Kane wouldn't do that, it changed every decision that then had to get made for the best interests of the state over the next 6 months. And, you know, we will talk later about how we paid the price for it.
Yeah, you'll have a
But
chance to
that
get into
happened.
this. Okay.
I want it for the record.
I want to give one more person at least a chance to add to this. Did I see a hand or no?
I actually would love to hear Speaker Doria's comments on transition, and because again, you were going through your own transition. How did it feel to you, what we were doing?
Say your name, even though you've been tagged.
Joe Doria. To be honest, we were so busy doing the legislative transition that we really weren't paying close attention to what was going on in the front office. We were busy trying to get ourselves together. Remember, the Assembly for 4 years had been under Republican control. We were busy, myself and Wayne Bryant, trying to just make sure that we could get our committee structure up and to begin to deal with some of the issues. And to be honest, the only issue I remember that we were immediately involved with was with Greg on the auto insurance, because that was the first issue. So during our transition, we were working very hard to try to deal with the very complicated auto insurance issue. And there was a personality issue there, which was very, very difficult to deal with. There was a special committee set up, if you remember, that was going to function on auto insurance, and the chairman of the insurance committee, the new insurance committee who had been actively involved, Mike Adebato, was not going to be on it. That's right. And I had the pleasure of telling him that. Fortunately, I was able to do that, and he was very reasonable. The governor, remember, he was not happy, right, and he wanted to speak to the governor, but in the end, he was supportive, and we were able to get it done. But so our transition was, at that time, very important, and we were going through a lot. And we were also lost our executive director, because if you remember, Dick Coffey became very ill. And so not only did we have the problem of trying to organize ourselves, we also had the difficulty with the executive director, who had the experience of doing the leadership, not there, and dealing with the auto insurance issue immediately, which worked out in the end very well.
Thanks, Joe. I think we'll be getting back to some of that a little later when in this session on the legislative perspective later this afternoon. So with that, I'm going to thank all of you for what you did then and for what you did today and for what you're going to do for the rest of this session and as we go forward. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Leadership fight. Can you draw the next one too?
Is it really?
Thank you for coming back, or staying, and welcome to the second panel. I want to say just a word to people on the panel and everyone. When you refer to people, even if they're in the room, if you give last names too, since for posterity, so that would be helpful. There are a number of people who wanted to be here who couldn't for a variety of reasons. Governor Florio mentioned John Lynch, who had to be in North Carolina today, but was going to be here, and so we'll talk with him and others as time goes by. The panel, our second panel, Doug Berman and Steve Persky, who were on the first, Carl Van Horn, who was Director of Policy, and
here's the, I'll give you $20.
Okay. Greg Lawler was Legislative Counsel. Jamie Foxx was Deputy Chief of Staff, as you heard. I think what we're going to do is talk. When I was trying to set up this event, the initial agenda I had two panels, one on designing, presenting, and passing the fiscal 90 state budget, and then a second one on assault weapons. And two things happened. One was I had panelists for each of those, and for the one on the budget, there were 4 panelists, and one by one, they either couldn't come or they told me they weren't really involved, and it was left that panel was just going to be Doug Berman. And I realized history would repeat itself. So, and the other thing, the more important thing, was that a number of you pointed out, and as has already been made clear, that these four issues were so intertwined during the transition, the first 6 months of insurance, guns, the budget, and education, that you really couldn't pull them apart too well. So we're going to start to try to talk about them in the order in which they arose, I guess, and continue where we were with the first panel with Doug and talking about the budget. And I'd ask you also to think about the question Angelo Genova asked at the end of the last panel of were there policy choices or compromises you were making along the way, or were you, or not?
Well, there are certainly trade-offs, but to set up kind of as we took office, and the swearing-in picture there is out in the hall, a nice starting point. Right? By that point, we knew we had a yawning budget crisis for a way to solve the then current fiscal year, and an even larger one for the first fiscal year it was going to come over. Tactically, from a political point of view, we knew we wanted to do the substance, and we had to do car insurance first so that the governor could deliver on a promise from the campaign that assault weapons would be difficult. And as I said at the outset of the end of the last session, the quick solution, raising the sales tax to help close the then current year, Governor Kane refused to go forward on. And so from that moment on, a whole different set of choices faced Governor Florio in how to resolve what we had to do. Knowing that in the sequence of things, he had his inaugural address, and then it's 3 weeks later, Steve, 4 weeks later is the budget address. So we didn't have a lot of time to figure out what to do. There was a series of discussions early on that when we dealt with the budget, which we would do in June, the hope was to cut a lot of the budget, which eventually we did. The governor's budget was actually the first time it was smaller in state spending year over year in the budget we introduced, but we still needed taxes. And to just try and balance it with the sales tax and wait for what we all anticipated would be the looming Abbott v. Burke decision, and eventually deal with that, with the income tax, which had been tied historically in New Jersey to school funding. A series of meetings were held with the new legislative leadership as they were testing that proposition of could we sequence them that way. Speaker and I were remembering it was in the then governor's outer office, not his small office, but the Speaker, his majority leader, Senator Lynch. I don't know if you were there, Senator Dalton, or not, but some of Senator Lynch's leadership was with him. Steve was there. And the Speaker and the Majority Leader of the Assembly kind of communicated that they did not believe their caucus would be able to want to deal with taxes twice, deal with the sales tax and wait on the school formula. And coming out of that, it then set in course that we would try to come up with a fiscal plan over the next 4 or 5 months while we passed car insurance and the guns, and then come back and deal with it. And I remember, because going back, we were weak on relationships to the legislature in the leading people early on in the administration, and Steve really being the only one, and him not having been in Trenton for a while, other than Jamie, who had come over from the legislative side. I saying to Steve, politically, we'll never get out of this hole. We should take them on. We should face down the caucus, and Steve's telling me, you can't do that. That's not going to work against everything else we had to do. Again, those choices led to how we played out the next 6 months. And, let's go to other things that then came on, because then the budget and school formulas are in the background as the first issue is car insurance.
Okay, Greg, you want to take it from there?
Sure. Let me actually start before the governor was elected governor. Everybody knew auto insurance in New Jersey was a disaster. We were fortunate enough to have jurisdiction over insurance. Sort of stepped into it gingerly at first. I don't know, maybe 2 years before the governor's race. Had a series of hearings, not really with the expectation that the Congress was going to do something, but really as an educational / political endeavor. The result of that was not only did the auto insurance situation in New Jersey get worse. Carl, who actually remembers things, reminded me that it was the #1 issue in the state. In a purely political sense, whoever created the JUA, it was a political gift from heaven. I think the governor himself came up with the expression that, the JUA is DOA.
Said that the night of the election.
I think you said it many times. The interesting part is that the governor, because he cared, was actually totally prepared to deal with it. Doug, you mentioned before, or Steve, maybe you did, are you really going to fix this thing? Well, the answer was yes. Why not? It's fixable. It was a promise from the campaign. It was a fixable problem. It was a mess. But like a lot of problems, you start pulling them apart, and they're not really that complicated. You can figure out how to deal with them. The thing that when we went to, obviously we're there, Carl showed me, we have our, 5-page description of, what we're going to do on auto insurance. You start talking to the legislature. I remember Kathy rolling her eyes at me a few times, or whatever the gesture was.
There was the occasional hand gesture too.
The speaker actually got involved in this himself. I don't know what's happened to Paul Anzano, but he was a very good person who understood insurance, and we worked very carefully with. There was a momentum behind it. I can't help this because it's how I think, but it is, a marked contrast to what you see going on around the country today, where, nobody really cares about the substance, and it just what political enemy can we attack?
That's right.
They're frankly, a partisan comment, they're all going to pay a price for it because it's just attack. But it really was a substantive solution to a problem. Not that anything's easy, but it got taken apart, put back together again. I think with some enthusiasm, the legislature passed it.
Was it bipartisan
Yes.
support?
Yes, there were Republican votes in both houses. Not all of them.
Not all of them.
But there was a significant. I think there were in the Senate there were 2 or 3 or 4. In the House there were more.
There were more than
Yeah.
But even an issue like this, and I think this is also going on today. Nothing is ever free. You pay a price for everything you do because everything is controversial. There's somebody on the other side. And Bob Del Tufo, remember, I think we got sued 43 times by the insurance industry and didn't lose a one.
That's why Florio wanted him for Attorney General, you see?
but it is, and Steve referred to this before, it is enacting policies, good policies. You use up political capital each time you do it. The insurance industry was I don't mean they're the enemy, but they were the enemy in this fight. They didn't just lose. They lose and they fought back again. And they fought back with some of the other groups that, are going to be the result of other things we talk about here. And it's a very, you confront a very, very formidable, very organized, wealthy, powerful coalitions. And again, you see a lot of exactly the same thing going on today. There are grassroots groups out there. There's some grassroots participants, but there's a lot of money behind those grassroots participants. And they're trying to exact a price for the policies that are.
Just interjecting, one of my very clever but ill-advised remarks was when Allstate said they were going to leave the state. I said, adios. And then I said, well, they brag about the fact that they have their hands around us. The question is, which part of our anatomy?
Good hands, yeah.
I do recall that. I don't believe that anybody left the state. One of the reasons was because we said if you leave, adios, you're not just leaving for auto insurance, you're leaving for everything. And they didn't want to leave, as it turned out. But again, it is, when as others have said, it's a tribute to the governor and his approach to things. But you find a substantive problem that needs solving, you go attack it, understand it. It also happens to be, in this case, a political gift from God that you get to fix it. But it is part of a calculation of every time you do something, you've got to husband your political capital because no matter how popular something is, there are people out there opposed to it, and they are organized and they fight back.
One of the resources we had was Sam Fortunato, was the insurance commissioner. He was an ex-executive, high level, understood everything. We'd have meetings with the insurance people. They would give you what they would normally give you. Sam would know what was real and what was not. He was a very, very valuable resource.
And Kenny Merrin, you mentioned before,
That's right.
was very helpful in the process.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So, guns, Steve. So the governor said guns started from the incident in California and his experience in Camden before the election.
And it was, as I recall it, I was not involved, obviously, in the design of the campaign, but I did watch it, and I certainly knew, as did everybody else, that it was one of the things the governor was very focused on and mentioned as part of the major early agenda. And as you've already heard, the decision was taken to do insurance first and then the guns. My recollection, just to follow up on something that Doug said, because he did trigger a recollection, I do remember the meeting, and I thought it was in your office, but wherever it was, what I think I remember is that the assembly leadership was telling us, this is early in the process, this might have been January, February, March.
It was after the budget message.
Okay, and the message that I was getting, at least that I remember, was the assembly leadership was telling us, whatever we're going to wind up having to do, we want to do it once.
Right.
We don't want to have a tax vote here and a tax vote there. Hold off as long as you can, get the school decision down if you can, and then figure out what we're going to do and do it once.
The only caveat would be that the biggest problem was the Democrats, Democrats just took over, that a large part of the caucus felt that the sales tax was a regressive tax that hurt poor people, especially urban poor people, and that the income tax was a progressive tax, so Democrats should be for an income tax and not necessarily putting a sales tax in first. That was really very strong amongst the urban legislators and the back caucus, and that's what was one of the problems, because they felt, we're Democrats, we're the majority now, we're going to put in Republican tax first and not do the Democratic tax.
I recall exactly that way, and as I suspect we'll hear in a little while from Senator Dalton, that message didn't resonate all that well as we moved down the hall. But what I clearly remember is that we were told by the assembly leadership, do this once.
Yep.
And that reinforced the notion of doing these in phases. So we get to assault weapons, and I've been trying unsuccessfully, and Bob can't help me, to remember. He designated a senior deputy attorney general. Thank you. That's exactly right. I should have asked you. Why wouldn't it? Peter Harvey worked with us on that. The good news was, from a political point of view, that while we were going to have a lot of work to do in terms of the details of exactly how we were going to define what it was that we were going to ban under what circumstances, and there was a lot of back and forth with that, with the PBA and with a number of others, my recollection of it now is that we started that process with a sense of comfort that we were going to get 41 votes in the Assembly. It may have been it may be that after all these years my recollection is tilted because of what happened in the Senate, but my sense of it now is that while we had some work to do and we did it, the Assembly leadership was on board, and that we were able to get the bill through the Assembly, which we did first for all the obvious reasons. The Senate was a problem from jump. There was one Republican senator who would have crawled over cut glass for the opportunity to vote for the bill, and nothing that anybody said to him in his own caucus or anywhere else was going to dissuade him from that. In fact, what he really wanted was to be the only Republican that voted for the bill. Anybody can't guess who that was? Okay. Right, Donnie? Yeah. Okay. And why it wasn't Donnie, by the way. Okay, so we needed, technically we needed 20 Democrats, but we made a decision from the beginning that we really wanted to have at least 21 Democrats for a whole bunch of policy and political reasons. That was a brutal exercise. The one piece of it that I remember the most, it seared me that day, and it has stayed with me all this time. I just don't remember the name of the senator, I believe from Hudson County, who was involved. But at one point, I get a call from Senator Lynch. Keep in mind, this was when the Senate offices were on the first floor of the annex. So to get from my office to Senator Lynch's office, you walk down the State House, the main corridor, went out the side door in front of the Senate chamber, outside, inside again, walked down that long hall, and Lynch's office was on the left at the end. That becomes relevant because I get a call that Senator Lynch needs to see me in his office with Senator.
Chrissy Jackman?
No, Chrissy Jackman's name I would never forget. Tom Cowan. Thank you. That's exactly right. John Lynch is in his office with Tom Cowan and needs to see me. Okay. Only that was the day that the bill was going to be voted in the Senate, and there were I don't know how many hundreds of people there to object to the bill. None of them looked like me. None of them was dressed like me. None of them spoke many of the same words that I speak. So I asked the state trooper, who happened to be a distant cousin of mine, asked the state trooper who was assigned to me and who was in plain clothes, as it turns out, luckily, to walk with me to get there. And it took the better part of a half hour for me to negotiate that space, and I believed then and I believe now that if the state trooper had been in uniform and if anybody had recognized me, which nobody did, as being the governor's chief of staff, I never would have made it to the other hall. It's the only time in my entire life, seriously, that I was ever afraid for my life. And I really was. It was the most horrible. They were breaking windows in the annex, and they were screaming, and you just can't imagine what was going on. We really had the belly of the beast with that. That's my clear recollection. As far as the logistics of the politics were concerned, John Lynch did everything he had to do. We wound up, I believe, with 21-1. If it wasn't 21-1, it was 22-1. But we wound up with what we needed to get done.
Steve, you only had one Republican?
Yes.
Two mobbed it?
No, we had just the Republican from the South somewhere. That was the only.
For the record, yes. Bill Gormley.
It was Gormley. I don't think Bob Martin was in the Senate at that point.
He was in the Assembly.
He was in the Assembly.
He was in the
It was
Assembly.
Leanna Brown was in the
Leanna Brown was
in the Senate.
Well,
No, we had one Republican senator, and that was from the 2nd District. And as I said, he made it very clear to me, I assume he made it very clear to the governor, that this wasn't about the governor, this wasn't about the bill, this was he wanted to be, and I'm not complaining. I mean, he's obviously a friend, but he was there from the beginning.
What was the end of that sentence? He wanted to be what?
He wanted to be the only, if he could help it, he wanted to be the only Republican that voted for the bill. For whatever political or policy reasons may have motivated him, which I can't speak for. In any event, I was never, until that last day, until John Lynch had Tom Cowan in that office, I was never sure that we would have 21 Democrats. I believed that we were comfortable with 20, but obviously for our own purposes, to have 20 Democrats and 1 Republican wouldn't have been, from our point of view, as politically desirable as it was to get 21 and 1. And that's what we fought for, and John Lynch, in my opinion, then as now, did yeoman service with respect to that, kept us fully apprised, told us where we needed, where Christy Jackman was a tough vote, but at the end of the day was there. But John would call us periodically, you need to talk to so-and-so, so-and-so's worried about this and that. Sometimes it was pretty because it dealt with, well, I have a problem with this definition and I really need you to change. That was easy. Some of it wasn't so pretty because a vote for the bill would depend on circumstances that had nothing to do with the content of the bill. But we didn't do anything immoral or improper, and the bill got passed.
Okay. And that
That one I don't know about.
And, you know, it was the first ever in the United
Absolutely.
States
Absolutely.
assault weapon ban ever.
And in my own view, nobody from Boston ever spoke to me about it. But in my view, when the governor 3 years later got the Profile and Courage Award, the press attention to it at the time dealt principally with the issues of the taxes and his ability to stand up and fight for the tax program. In my own mind, the gun bill was every bit as important in that determination.
was the initial, when the gun bill was passed in what month?
Gun bill was passed in, I want to say, April or May. I mean, it was warm enough.
April.
It was warm enough that half of those people in the halls were there in rolled up T-shirts, with tattoos showing and cigarette packs in the rolls. So it was not. It was. They didn't need coats and jackets. Let me put it that way. It was April or May.
So, Carl, let's, education played throughout this, but then how'd that work?
Yeah, well, a segue from that is I remember when the assault weapons bill was signed in the governor's outer office, Speaker Doria was there, and he came up to me and essentially grabbed me by the lapels. And he said, "You're not going to make us do something tough again, are you?" And I said, as a matter of fact, I have some printouts I want to bring over to your office tomorrow about the school funding bill. But really this was, in a sense I want to say about the Education Act, it was really a lifetime in the making, in the sense that Governor Florio's commitment to this as a person, to education, is very deep. And I remember distinctly the first time we assembled, he assembled several people, as he was often wont to do, to write the same speech, and so we kind of competed with each other for that honor. And someone asked him, "Governor, you've just been elected by a huge majority. What do you want to be known for?" And I think a lot of people thought he'd say, I'm going to reform auto insurance, or these were all the things in the campaign. He said, "I want an equal opportunity education for every young child in New Jersey." Now, to some people in that room, that was a bit of a shock. To me, it wasn't, because I had spent, as he said before, the previous couple of years in fairly secret meetings. Obviously the people in the campaign knew and others around him, but we didn't talk about these things in the press. And Doug and his colleagues wisely kept him from talking broadly about these issues during the campaign. But we had very intense discussions about it. In fact, we met with many legislators. We had lots of conversations about this for years. It was really 2 years in the making. And the reason I think the other reason beside the governor's personal commitment to it was this was an issue, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's something that can have been kicked down the road for many, many years. The Robinson v. Cahill decision was 1973. The first Abbott decision, Abbott 1, found that it didn't meet muster and had to be reconsidered. It was then kicked over to the administrative law judge Lefelt, who wrote, I think, an 800-page decision that only Bob Del Tufo could write something that long. And that was, as Carrie Edwards did, postponed that from being considered. And so we all knew that it was going to happen. And the governor, but it wasn't that he wasn't in any way forced, in my opinion, to this position. It's something that he wanted to do, felt very strongly about, and we were preparing for that, as we did with many of these other policies. So it wasn't at all part of the campaign in any way. And in fact, I went back and looked at the Eagleton poll. And one of the questions they always ask is, what are the key issues facing the state today, right? An open-ended question. Not a single person was recorded as having said education, all right? The top issues were auto insurance reform, guns, violence, other kinds of things. So no one said that. And, you know, here's the governor right after he's elected saying we're going to do that, and not a surprise to me. So this issue, I think, had to be addressed from his perspective. And I think the other point about his style of governing was, I guess I would call it, the governor is not a person who likes to have messes left around. In other words, a problem unaddressed is offensive to him. And here was a problem that needed to be addressed. Not a trivial problem, but a huge problem. And so we worked towards coming up with the policy. And, of course, these were the days before, I guess I would say, advanced computer analysis, in which I remember there was one young guy from the Woodrow Wilson School, I can't remember his name, who was essentially the only person in the state government who could do these computer runs. And at one point he told us he wanted to go off and do something else, and we kind of basically locked him in the State House and said,
and
not acceptable.
Not
right?
to interrupt Carl, but the way we got him, right? He belonged to the Education Commissioner,
right?
And that was a holdover, right? And so nobody told me whether we could really do it or not, but I transferred him over to OMB, he and an associate, as an emergency thing, and then Education Commissioner Cooperman called and said, well, you can't do that. And I said, so well, stop me. And so that's how we had the resource to actually be able to do all of the analysis in the end. You know, and this young kid did it all.
That's right. And, of course, the problem when you have that analysis is people can look at the numbers and figure out who's going to win and who's going to lose very, very specifically. So we did hundreds and hundreds of runs, tweaking this issue and that, shuttling back and forth between Senator Dalton and Senator Lynch's office, Speaker Dorey and his colleagues. And this all got out pretty quickly because as soon as you give it to one person in the legislature, it's going to be in Dan Weissman's office within moments, who was the Star-Ledger reporter, who was very effective at the time. So everybody knew what was going to happen, and I and probably everybody else at this table and in this room who worked in the administration entertained many, many meetings with legislators explaining to us why the formula we thought we were going to do was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of.
Can't possibly do it.
Yeah, I can't possibly do it. My district will die. I will never win my office again, et cetera, et cetera. Well, they were right in some cases, but they were. We nonetheless persevered, and again, it's important that, as has been said earlier, we weren't sure when the court was going to decide, although I think Steve and others had pretty good antenna about that, about what was going to happen, and I don't think we had any doubt about what it was going to say. And so the court did render its decision in early June. I think it was June 5th of 1990.
Is it that late?
I think so, yeah. And one of the interesting things about it was, for those of you who think about how slow government moves, think about this. The decision came out in the morning, about 10 o'clock. Right. Steve convened us, and he told us the governor will announce his position at noon. Right?
Yep.
We're sitting there looking at this whatever 100-page decision.
It had been delivered. It was released by the Supreme Court at 10 o'clock, but they had sent over some copies for us when they got there at 9 o'clock. So we had like 1 hour.
Extra
head
hour,
start.
right?
We had
right.
1 hour head start.
And I remember saying to one of my colleagues at the time, I don't remember exactly who, we don't really need to analyze this. We know, John Shore and I and others sat down and started drafting some remarks for the governor because we knew what he was going to say. And then he went on and said, basically, we're going to make this happen. And of course, we had the computer runs and the formula all, in many ways worked out. Now, one of the other factors to point out here is that, again, because of what Doug said earlier, we had a fixed amount of money available, right? Because we knew essentially what was possible in many ways, having been worked out with the legislature. So it's not like we had flexibility in terms of how much money was going to be spent. There was X amount of money. And so the formula was clearly a zero-sum game. It was not something that we had much flexibility on in terms of changing the amount of money. And it really meant that huge amounts of money were going to be poured into these 30 districts, which were the huge winners, and there were hundreds of losers in the process. Much more can be said about that. But in the process, of course, we alienated huge amounts of people in service of this very worthy goal, including many of the Democratic Party's most important constituents, the New Jersey Education Association, primary number one, the suburban school districts, and many other people. But again, in addition to, obviously, as I said before, the kudos to the governor's leadership in this, the leadership of the legislature was stalwart, and they got this through. Again, I think they believed in it as passionately as the governor did, or at least they made it happen, whichever. But it was an incredibly difficult struggle. And within 1 month, after less than a month actually, the Supreme Court decision being announced, we had in place the Quality Education Act, allocating more than $1 billion additional money to education. And there's so much more to be said about it, but just one point to make, that at the end of the day, when Governor Florio stepped down, the gap between the richest and the poorest districts had been cut in half during that period. So I stop there.
Yeah, so I want to, because the challenge of getting the budget balanced and knowing that we had to redo the school formula, right, was this puzzle that we were working on for a number of months, right? Carl's talking about the runs. We knew we had to cut the budget, and we cut $2 billion, and those cuts were painful. We still couldn't make it balance, and it's the first time I ever heard people from the tax division, they came in and told me we had negative growth. I'm going, what's negative growth? Well, revenues were shrinking because we had gone into a recession in New Jersey. So every month, the gap was getting bigger. And we knew what a penny on the sales tax would do. And the debate was on the margins, could you add some elements to the sales tax so that you could get a little bit more revenue? Because historically, when you were in a goods economy and 70% of the money came out of goods, sales tax raises a lot of money. As we moved to a service economy, fewer and fewer things were being taxed that were part of our commerce. And so how to broaden the base of what would be covered in the sales tax was an element of getting enough revenues, assuming you would use the sales tax to balance state financing. Knowing that, we no longer a AAA credit, but that was a very important thing, and it really mattered, and we were intent on keeping it. As Carl said, that left you the income tax, and a lot of runs were done politically as to who and where that number could be, right? And it was finally resolved that we would only raise taxes on people who earned over $100,000, which was 17% of New Jerseyans. But that number was estimated to be about $1 billion. And so we knew there was that $1 billion into the pool. And then, as Carl said, they were doing the runs. And a very critical decision of the policy people working on the school formula was that pension aid should become part of the general pool. Now, people have to understand this historical issue here, right? Early on, school teachers, the state said, we'll pay your Social Security. That became, the state will pick up the pension costs, right? Which over time led to very wealthy districts cutting deals with their teachers' unions such that in the last 5 years, their teachers would get this big bump because the entire bill would be paid for out of state aid. And it was off of the top. The first money went to pay for teachers' pensions. And my memory is it's $1 billion.
That's when the state did pay for the pensions, not when we stopped.
That's right.
Right. $1.4 billion, and an element to get enough money, because another, like Carl, we had conversations with the governor, and it was, Governor, we can solve the Abbott 30 districts without having to do anything else. He said, no, I want to help most kids in New Jersey. And so by putting that $1 billion in, and the formula that Carl and Tom Corcoran and others came up with helped 80% of the kids in New Jersey. 80% of the school districts got more money. The challenge was, much went west, much went south, because they were poorer relative to the income tax. But what to do, right? And so that, the Quality Education Act said that pension aid should be treated the same as everything else. Those equations then worked, the three together. I remember that morning, Steve, because this is the only thing I took back out to prepare for here, because it still bothers me, which was the dictum in Abbott on the issue of teacher pensions, where they say, we note that teacher pensions distributed to all districts is in effect counter-equalizing. That was their question, right? But the administration considerations justify the present system. We will, at this time, abide by that judgment without foreclosing the possibility that such aid may be constitutionally infirm. I remember saying to Steve, we got to go challenge this. If this stands, the whole thing will fall apart. I later saw the Chief Justice after he was no longer Chief Justice. He's told me this is the single thing he regrets the most, that leaving this as dictum rather than a holding, when you look at what the future of the state is.
And that's what killed us. The NJA, which was supportive of the entire formula and the fact that more money was going, they opposed the inclusion of pensions for a number of reasons. Specifically, they felt it was going to hold down salaries.
That's right.
And that it would become then a negotiable item. And so the NJA opposed it, and we passed it. And when we passed it, we walked through, and Bernie will remember, we walked through a gauntlet of teachers who were spitting on us at dawn because of the fact that we passed this.
Yes.
It was a better formula. It provided more money. But because the pensions and the union leadership said this was bad, they were against it, and they worked very much against us as a result of the inclusion of the pensions. And eventually the pensions have been taken out.
Right. But the irony is, and this is where the union leadership, right, and how this all plays out in real life, right? 80% of the districts, teacher salaries would have gone up because there was more money. It was in the wealthiest districts. And what we had said was the state will make the contributions. We'll guarantee that the contributions will made. It will be the kind of creditor to make sure the school districts ante up so that your funds are in there. But the wealthiest districts controlled the union. And that was a key part of that. And so, this decision of whether or not, and the only other thing I will tell you, Carl, or my memory is, because I remember it clearly, it was in May, and we were still trying to put all this together. And it was clear we were having trouble. Governor held a press conference, and he knew this better than any of us, all but told the Supreme Court, guys, I need your decision. Right? He basically went there, I'm pretty sure it was in May, and said, the court needs to rule. They need clarity in order to get it. And it was 3 weeks later that then the court decision came down.
There was a lot of dialogue to that effect going on. I mean, obviously the court was not then, as it never has been quite properly, able to tell anybody what they're going to do or when they're going to do it. But there was a clear line of communication that the court understood the realities of the state's schedule and the state's budget process, and understood the importance of the timing of that decision with respect to the submission of a budget.
Right, but the governor ended up holding this press conference because it was that decision that helped us at least make the argument as we went into that 1 week of round-the-clock legislative sessions, and
All
maybe
night.
you'll
All night.
for a week when we passed in sequence the sales tax increase, the budget, the income tax increase, and the QEA.
Yep.
Let me call on Jamie Foxx. You joined the administration later than all these people in December, right?
Yes, I was not. I was there from the first day of the administration, but I was never someone who I had never worked on the campaign and was not part of the transition at all. I did listen to Kathy Crotty for many years of my life. But I had worked for a number of elected officials and worked in Trenton and knew a lot of the legislators. So for whatever reason, Steve Persky and the governor offered me this position. My recollection is that when you, from a 30,000-foot standpoint, the governor had just won 61-38. He brought both houses of the legislature with him. You can make a decision, do we move quickly and get his agenda done while we have the public on our side? We've just won a landslide victory. I think in the next 6 months, as all these gentlemen are pointed to, and they're the ones who set the policy along with the governor, and the legislature, we marched down the field and we voted for a number of progressive, democratic valued legislation, farm education, auto insurance, everything that's been mentioned. And the darkest day for me was when the legislature went up for re-election, went down in terrible defeat, our majorities. That was tougher for me, actually, even than the governor's defeat by 25,000 votes, but who was counting? But the fact that the leaders, the Joe Doria, the Bernie Kennys, the John Lynch, who delivered those votes, those were not easily done. And you take, in John Lynch's case, vehemently opposed the idea of an assault weapons ban. Yeah. He thought it was bad politics. I actually believe, and many people to this day believe, that one of the things that put us in great political difficulty in re-election was the assault weapon ban. I do not believe that. I actually believe just the opposite. I actually believe that it's one of those things that actually kept the race as close as it was. I believe that ultimately, at the end of the day, the assault weapons ban was something that helped us at the polls in re-election. But I mentioned that, with Diane Quinton, who was the day-to-day handholder of the legislature, I guess when the senior members at this table would make the decision, and there would be some fallout, and Diane and I and Gene Holtz and Connie Null and a number of other people would actually visit a lot of legislators, find out what their needs were, made sure that the governor had to go around to a district and appear so that we could rally the troops and support in different districts around the state. And where were they? Were they in Bergen? Were they in South Bergen? That's what we did. We sort of picked up, I guess, the pieces from any political damage that occurred from all of these bills that the governor wanted done, and everyone was done. Not one legislative initiative failed. Not one.
It has fascinated me all of these years. It still continues to. But I suggest to you that there's a way that you can all make an awful lot of money. Make a wager. Ask somebody to name the only governor of New Jersey whoever signed increases in the income tax, the sales tax, and the corporate business tax. You will win that wager every time, because the answer will be Jim Florio, and it's wrong. It's Tom Kane. And,
all done in one day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I had that conversation with Tom a couple of years ago, and we had a reception. I forget what it was, but he sort of graciously acknowledged the responsibility. But it stuns me because you're right. I had forgotten that meeting. But the fact is that after all of these years, nobody in New Jersey will credit Tom Kane with that. They will all credit credit in quotes, credit Jim Florio for that. And it still amazes me that he was able. And I don't criticize him for having signed those bills. I voted for most of them. It was in 1982.
Were you still there at the time?
I was right before I left. I was majority. I was the majority leader when you were the minority leader, and that was
You just left right after that?
right.
Yeah, I was trying to remember.
Right. It was Kane's first. It was Kane's first budget in the spring of '82. I left in July, and I don't. I'm pretty sure I didn't vote for the sales tax, but I'm sure I voted for the income tax and the CBT. But Tom did it. I thought he was right to do it at the time on the merits. I thought he was right to do it politically, and he got away with it.
Well, because we had good times. The externalities, this is where I want to go back to. There are two big things that, besides the fact we were in a recession, which is never good politically for people. One was, it was the beginning of what Greg referred to as now the politics of personal destruction, rather than the politics of trying to solve problems. I had great discussions, and there were others here, with Republican members as we were trying to solve the budget. They did a lot to educate me as to the choices and everything else. But somewhere along the line, the decision was clearly made. There will be no Republican support for any of this stuff. Even guys who we had conversations with, that was clear, right? It wasn't about what was good for New Jersey. This was about the politics of Democrat and Republican.
There were never going to be any Republican votes.
And there were, and I'm sure you'll speak to that when you're on your panel. So, but there were, in one article, the Assemblyman Haitayan talked about me in ways as to what my character was, and it was alluded to that there was some controversy around that back in those months. He had never met me, never once had met me, and yet is quoted throughout this article in a very respected newspaper talking about me, all about a change in the politics. And it's interesting now because that became the norm in Congress, and it's hurt this country going forward. The other is July 1st of 1990, a Social Security tax increase went into effect, and everybody's paycheck went down. And people on the boardwalk said, that's the increase, the income tax increase. My taxes just went up because the income tax increase that Governor Florio. That increase didn't go into effect for 6 more months. But if you try to explain to a voter who is in a recession, in a pinched economy, that no, that's something that was passed by the United States Congress a few months ago and has nothing to do with what's going on now, you will lose that political argument.
But I also,
every time.
I also think that one thing that we learned was when you said, it was raising taxes only on 17%. I mean, we think that 83% of the public benefited by the tax equity plan. But a lot of people believed who didn't have any, well, my son may make that type of money, or my daughter make that type of money. There was almost a psychological.
Or I want to be able to make that kind of
money. So even though it's only going to 17%, there was a negative reaction as if they didn't find it. They thought it was hitting them, though they knew it wasn't hitting them, but they thought little Johnny might get there someday. So,
the other point I wanted to make about is we haven't talked about this yet, but there was a revenue sharing component in this to keep property taxes down. And if you look at the charts of property tax in the history of New Jersey, there's only one time when it goes sharply down, and that's the year after this budget went into effect. But it just shows you how difficult it is for people to understand that process and how it works. And actually, what it did, we learned, and it wasn't just the NJEA, it was every district who wanted to raise taxes who now had someone to blame.
Right.
And they did a very good job of that.
And the converse is that when the property taxes went down, neither the governor nor the legislature got the credit for that. The mayor got the credit for that.
No, of course not.
Governor?
So, and every governor since then that tried to defy gravity on that point has paid a price for it, because it is not something that you can convince people that Trenton is actually helping them.
Correct.
I don't know, is Brenda still here? Brenda was at the meeting that we had with the Hands Across New Jersey people. I invited the leadership, about 5 or 6 people, into the governor's office to have a discussion about what they were concerned about. And they were very nice people, sort of lower middle class people, working class people. And I said, how many people here make more than $85,000? They all laughed. None of them made that. I said, well, you're not going to pay any. First of all, the tax hasn't gone into effect, and you're not going to pay anything anyway. Oh. And then I said, how many people got a homestead rebate? Will we get a homestead? And they all raised their hand. How many people are getting money back from the JUA elimination? $300, whatever it was for it. They all raised their hand. I said, why are you here? Everything we've done is for you. And the one guy, Budzash, the fellow who was the chairman, says, well, one day I want to be a millionaire.
Yes.
And I don't want to ever have to pay taxes. That's
That-
I, at that point, sort of gave up on logic.
But
I think of myself as a possible person who's going to get to
Or
that.
or somebody who, because we were talking about this, when the dollars that came together in the coalition that kind of came together, the NRA was the single biggest funder against this administration. It underwrote Hands Across New Jersey. John Budjass was a front man for the NRA. It had nothing to do with that, other than that the gun lobby had decided that you had to pay a political price for doing what was right on guns.
And let me just say this, a few years later, in discussions with me, he admitted to that, because he became very disillusioned and actually became supportive of Democrats, and he actually said that to be true.
But I think we have to look back and listen. A lot was done by Governor Florio. That when you look back on, many of us have worked with different people. Every one of us should be proud that worked for him, for the simple reason that look what was accomplished, and look how we fought back. We went neighborhood to neighborhood, houses to houses, and we came damn close.
25,000.
25,000. And listen, a loss is a loss. You know, it's tough to lose by 5 votes as it is by 5,000 or 50,000. But, you know, we were making progress, and it was just between the recession and the evil empire of, you know, the NRA and a couple other people who didn't philosophically agree with us. And sometimes when you take on an enemy, the enemy gets you back. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And, you know, but there's nothing that we should be ashamed of.
On that note, why don't we take a short break, and then we'll move to the legislative panel, and then we'll have time for comments and questions after that. So thank you all very much.
I'm Alan Rosenthal, and I'm moderating and I guess asking questions which legislators aren't going to answer, of course, for this panel. This is the panel on the legislative perspective on the Florio administration's first 6 months. I call this the truth panel. Let me introduce myself, since nobody has introduced me. I've spent a career studying legislatures, and so I certainly have a legislative perspective and little else. For the past few years, however, I've gotten a gubernatorial perspective. I've been writing a book on governors around the country, and it'll be out in March. The Best Job in Politics is the name of the book. The Best Job in Politics, for any of you who want to write it down. And that really reflects the gubernatorial perspective. You know, in looking into governors and talking with governors and surveying governors and reading memoirs of governors, I've come to realize how advantaged governors are when it comes to policy leadership. And I think you can tell from the two panels, the two previous panels, and Jamie Foxx's remarks that Florio got everything he wanted out of the legislature. This is not unusual in the country. Governors do very well. Not only New Jersey governors, although we think we have the most powerful governor, maybe the only powerful governor in the country, it isn't so. All governors are quite powerful. The differences among governors in the states in terms of their constitutional and statutory and political powers are far less than the differences between the powers of the governors and the legislatures in the 50 states. The difference between the power of governors and legislatures is quite significant. And this is primarily not because of the Constitution or the statute, it's because of the structure of the office. The governor is one, the legislature is many. The governor formulates an agenda. He may consult, he may, mull it over, he may decide, or she may. But the legislature has to agonize to get anywhere. It's the R's, the D's, the Assembly, the Senate. It's 80 legislators here, 40 legislators there, however many. And as one, the governor institutes both policy and, in most states, formulates the budget. The governor has an enormous defensive weapon in the veto power. So governors do well in their policy leadership. And I think here we'll explore, from the point of view of the legislature, a case of the respective powers and policy leadership, of the governor and the legislature during the Florio administration or during the beginnings of the Florio administration. The legislative panel here, all of you people know these legislators far better than I do, all who have served during that administration. Dan Dalton to my immediate right, Donnie DeFrancesco, Joe Doria, and Bernard Kenny. Now, I guess we ought to, start off. I'll ask questions and the conversation will proceed any which way it does. And I want to just start, at the obvious place with a bang. How did Governor Florio and the legislature work together on the tax issues during the early part of the administration? Should it have been done differently, or did it occur the only way it could have? I guess I should start with the former speaker.
That's a good question. A very good question. I think that the legislature, remember, the Assembly, and I can speak directly to the Assembly, the Senate is a different situation. The Senate had been Democratic all through the 1980s and into the 1990s. They actually, as Senator DeFrancesco just reminded me, didn't actually run with the governor in 1989. They had run in 1987, and they had a 4-year term through 1991. So the Assembly was Republican and had just turned Democratic. And so we were busy trying to reassert where we were within the context of not only the legislative authority, but also as it related to our own organization, as I said earlier. There was a great deal of confusion at the beginning. The issues were there. We believed, obviously, that we had a Democratic governor, and we should support that Democratic governor. That was extremely important, that we felt that we needed to be loyal. We felt that we needed to follow through on what the governor's initiatives were. And at first, that occurred. I think the communications, as Doug Berman pointed out, the treasurer pointed out, could have been much better. And I think that hurt as we went through that first 6 months. Everyone was feeling their way. And we had a lot of new members who had only recently been elected, who didn't really know the process, and that was part of the problem. So as it relates to the issue of the budget, and as I said earlier, the big issue was if we were going to raise taxes, we had to raise Democratic taxes. The income tax was a Democratic tax. The income tax was the progressive tax. The sales tax was the regressive tax. The caucus, especially the minority members of the caucus, very much opposed the sales tax because they felt it laid a heavier burden on the poorer people, especially those people living in the urban areas. And so that was the context of that continuous argument about, well, what should we do first? And that was the reason why when myself and Wayne Bryan, who was the majority leader, discussed the tax issue, we said, well, we're never going to get a sales tax passed unless the income tax is also going to be passed, because our members just felt it was not a democratic tax. And as Democrats, we needed to stand up for what we believed. So that was one of the big issues. And every one of these issues, whether it be the taxes, whether the easiest one in reality was doing the car insurance, except for the issue of the chair, Mike Adebato, and going around the insurance committee with the special committee. That was the most difficult part of that issue. Otherwise, it was a very easy issue for the members to vote on. But every other issue became more difficult. The assault weapons, up until the day of the vote, there wasn't the necessary 41 votes. There were a group of legislators from South Jersey, Tony Marsala being the leader of that group, who felt that it was going to hurt them very significantly. Those who came from counties like Gloucester County and Salem, who were in districts that had been Republican, now were Democratic, they didn't want to vote for it. And to be very honest, the reason why we got the vote was because of what Steve Persky described. The state police, for some reason, let all of the demonstrators, the NRA people, into the building. We were in the annex. They crowded the hall. They crowded the courtyard. During the debate, they broke a couple of windows in the annex, where we were at that time. We were in temporary quarters. The result of that was when I went back into the caucus after some discussion, and we still didn't have the votes, my question was, do you really want those people to have guns? And do you know what? The few people who had questions, Tony Marsala and the people from South Jersey, in the end, voted for it because of the actions of the NRA people who were there that day, the way they looked, the way they acted. That really had an impact. It was frightening, and Steve is absolutely right. I walked through that group. I refused the state police escort. I walked from my office, which was down the hall, to the chambers, and it was, I agree with Steve, I was a little more than afraid, one of the few times in my life, because they were not being very rational. So every one of these, every time we voted on something, there was a different reason for doing it. It was never easy, but in the end, my members were very, very dedicated to the governor. They believed in what the governor was doing. They believed in what we were doing. They felt it was the right thing, but politically they were very much afraid. And obviously they were correct in that assumption when the election came, a year and a half later. But it was the right thing, whether it be QEA. And the QEA, I never supported the pensions being included. I kept on saying we were going to get killed on that. But in the end, I said, if that's what the governor wants, that's what we'll do. But the main thing is, if we had the pensions in and kept them in, the pensions always would have been funded. We never would have had the problem we had today, because they would have been funded first out of all the school aid on a continuing basis. And we have to remember that the last time all the pensions were funded by the state was in the Florio administration. Since that time, the pensions have not been fully funded. So, I mean, we were acting responsibly. It was not easy. And the answer is, it was not easy. Every one of those votes was difficult for a different group of members. I remember people like Marlene Lynch Ford, who knew that it was going to be the end of her political career, but in the end, she did what was right. It wasn't easy. She and John Doyle, very tough district, 10th district. They did but they knew. Marlene Lynch a few times really were very difficult, but she did what she, in the end, believed was the right thing, to support the governor and to do the right thing for the citizens of the state.
Well, let me ask a question to any of the members, any of the senators or assemblymen. Did the legislature have any counter proposals, any way to modify things, or any way to change the strategy? Were there any suggestions that the legislature could make, or the legislative caucuses could make, that the governor
Alan,
might listen to.
Let me remind people, first of all, I was not the minority leader at that time. John Dorsey was. I was sitting in the back with Bill Wormley. By choice, even. By choice.
I was just going to say that. It was voluntary on your part.
Yeah, he was. And Chuck Italian, who was invited, was the assembly minority leader. And Bob Franks, I'll remind you, was the state chairman of the party, and my running mate and an assemblyman. So my view is more of a distant view of those first 6 months. Actually, Steve almost talked me into voting for the gun thing. I mean, I was very close to being the other vote, and of course would have been with Bill Gormley. But to your point, and it's vague to me, and I wasn't involved, and I didn't, I wasn't part of the leadership, so I wasn't meeting with the governor. I don't think there were any alternatives proposed by the Republicans. Certainly, no Republican alternatives. I wasn't privy to what was going on with all of you behind the scenes, but I was impressed, having been only minority leader for like 3 years earlier in the decade. I was impressed by the leadership's ability to get the votes to do all of this. In retrospect, and I've incurred the wrath of the NRA a few times also. I'm not sure. Is Jamie still here?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I could agree that perhaps that one bill, and I'm not suggesting it was not a good thing to do or anything like that. That might have been the one bill that I would have left out of the package in order to basically, from a political standpoint. I'm thinking of, you don't want the man to be there for 8 years.
From the governor's or political or from the legislators? Because
From the governor's standpoint.
I would ask you then, how many of those people in that hall, if the bill hadn't been passed, would have likely been Florio votes anyway?
But they funded, they helped Bob Franks run the campaign against, and as you say, 25,000 votes is not a lot of votes, very few votes, and I'm sure you have a variety of reasons why the 25,000 went the other way, starting with places in Newark like that. But I just think if there was one bill that I thought maybe you'd tackle down the road, so to speak, that was the one. But how would we know, Steve? And in defense, how would you know that 101.5 would be born?
I know it.
Hands Across New Jersey would have that effect perceptually with people, where people weren't paying the increase in the income tax, thought they were. I just think that might have been the one bill that perhaps could have been put off.
What you're suggesting is that the governor, in trying to do good policy, overreached politically, and it was mentioned by panelists earlier on. You pay a price.
I think politically it was just too much.
Let me just tell you a story, and this is a true story. Right before the vote on the assault weapons bill, I met with the chief lobbyist who was representing the NRA and all the Hunters Association and all of them. And he sat down in my office, and he knew that we were short on votes. And he said to me, understand, you get the votes, and we passed this. Understand, I'm not coming after you, and we're not coming after you or the governor on guns. We lose on guns. We're going to come after you on everything else you do. Anything you do today, anything you will ever do. We will be there. You won't know we're there, but we will be there, and we will make sure you lose and the governor loses. He said that to my face. It was a direct threat.
They always talk like that.
Right.
Let me just say. I had to listen to that so many times.
But this one, you're right.
You talking about Richie? Richie? Yeah.
But I have to admit, I was new to the speaker's job. No one had ever, during my years there, 10 previous years, had ever spoken to me like that. Yeah. It was a direct threat. And I do believe, and you're right, they did fund Hand Across New Jersey. They were there. And obviously, and Donnie's right, the governor is right here. 101.5, the Trentoni never existed before. They became an important part of what happened. Hands Across New Jersey, nobody would have known they even existed if 101.5 didn't exist, and had to change their format and needed to build up their ratings and create something. And it's the beginning of this this bashing radio that exists today, and all of what we have today, all this really great TV and radio that exists.
But the leadership of the legislature, the Democratic leadership, did a great job in getting these bills done. I thought so.
But their choice was only to get the votes. They didn't have a better strategy or a better alternative.
We presented, we made changes. Danny, why don't you talk?
Right?
We made recommendations and did change things.
Oh, okay.
Not necessarily always for the better, by the way.
Yeah, the context, I think, is important as far as the, and there was discussion earlier as far as the time and the fact that Joe and Wayne were new to their positions from a legislative perspective. They had been in the minority for the Kane years. Conversely, in our House, we had been in the majority during the Kane years. They ran with Governor Florio. We did not run with Governor Florio. And so that's sort of the context there, at least a backdrop of what was going on. So the leadership, however, in our House had changed, where John Russo, who was an able Senate president during the Kane years, where we maintained the majority under John's leadership, moved out, and John Lynch moved up. And I think the fact is that we were of agreement with the governor's office as to what the priorities were. We had dealt with auto insurance during Governor Kane's administration. I had been very involved in that, and we had passed legislation to change to make the threshold optional. We had talked about making health care primary as far as the PIP portion of automobile insurance. So there was sort of a familiarity with those issues, and because we had worked on them. So when the governor said during his campaign that auto insurance is going to be the first thing out of the box, that we were of total agreement with that. And then as we learned as his term went on, what Doug pointed out, that the budget situation was becoming more dour. I don't think, in fairness to other governors, that is the first time they got fudged up numbers by a previous administration. I think that's sort of, unfortunately, the way things happen in Trenton and probably happen in Washington. But that was the other issue, the budget issue. And then the third issue was Abbott, the pending Abbott decision. My feeling, and first of all, I have a tremendous background with Governor Florio. Governor Florio gave me the opportunity to participate in government. So, and when the point was made earlier that his just nature was, you didn't ignore problems. You addressed problems. You weren't there to tiptoe around problems. You were there to aggressively attempt to solve problems. He felt that it was important to aggressively solve the education problem. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that he represented one of the poorest school districts for many, many years in the country, and that's Camden. So when he made that an imperative, we may have thought from a retail level that was a mistake, but from a policy wholesale level, everybody in the room agreed with him. Everybody in our caucus, maybe with several exceptions, but for the most part, the vast majority of folks were ready to go and address the issue. And Jamie Foxx pointed it out because it was the right thing to do. And we had I was fortunate to serve with a lot of people who felt you were there to do the right things, and you were there to take on the tough issues, and you didn't dodge them. And I think now looking back on it, the reason we were there to some extent, at least in the Senate, is that we were, I think, a group of good retail politicians as well as wholesale policy-making politicians. And to some extent, the retail part of it, we may have forgotten, or it may have gotten lost in our early success. And I think that's important to note. We came out of the box. We were successful. We addressed a lot of important issues, whether it be auto insurance, assault weapons, the Sure issue with clean water, and we were on a roll, and we were going to keep on going. And I think if we had to do it over again, that Abbott issue should have been looked at, and we should have looked at it where we brought more people into the process as to what the issue was all about. Because as you heard earlier, there were a lot of moving parts to this, a lot of moving parts. And trying to get people to understand those moving parts on a retail level, because ultimately that's where we live, was very, very difficult. And became very difficult, I think, for the governor from a legislative perspective, and I'm sure Joe can speak to this too. I mean, just think of some of the names at that time we lost in the Senate that were just, to my mind, just very, very fine political folks that were public officials there for the right reasons. And we paid a heavy price for that. And I think we should have made sure that Abbott was understood by the general public better than it was.
Could I just inject a note here?
Sure.
Because just to reinforce the point that Dan made, that there were a number of people, particularly from the Senate side, coming and saying, don't do this year. Mm-hmm. You've already got a basket that's full of things you've done. Wait till next year. You don't have to go do it. And I said, well, you know, I had a couple of observations. One was a political observation, that now is the time to do tough things. Next year is going to be a legislative election year. You're going to have a problem doing it that way. So get things done that have to be done that are tough early on when you still have the perception of a mandate as a result of a good election outcome. And the other thing was just the sort of stubbornness of saying, you know, that means you have another whole year of kids that have wallowed around for the last 8 years with no resolving of the problems in some of our urban districts. So, but he's right that there are a number of people that came to me, particularly the head of the Senate, John Lynch, talking about why don't we slow this thing down.
Is there any hubris involved?
I'm sorry?
Hubris.
Hubris.
Probably so.
But you have to go back to the speaker's comment. The speaker was reading his caucus about whether or not we could separate out the two issues. And his read of his caucus was that wasn't going to be possible, that if we postponed dealing with Abbott and slowed it down and didn't deal with the income tax, because holding it for that we would never, his caucus would not pass the budget either. And that, you know, he had to get the votes as well. I mean, Steve, and so it was both houses that had to go along.
That was the yin and the yang. You've just put your fingers on it. The assembly leadership was saying, we need to do this, whatever we need to do it once. And the Senate leadership collectively was advising that we spread it out. And there were, even today, looking back on it, there are risks and there are positives and negatives to both approaches. We chose what we chose. I agree with Dan completely that even with the choice that we made to do it all at once, that there were things that in retrospect we could have done better and could have done more of in terms of addressing what you've called the retail politics, and I think that's exactly right. But there was never then, and to my way of thinking all these years later still isn't, any clearly defined, if you had done it like this, everything would have been okay. I don't accept that.
I'm not suggesting that.
Nobody is suggesting that.
Yeah.
No. tried to get, what was going
No. Dan was not. I didn't mean to suggest that you were. I think what you said, I agree with every word of it. There are things that, as we've all said today, we could have done differently and could have done better, but there is, at least to my way of thinking looking back, there is no one road that we could have taken and done what we needed to get done and still have come out clean on the politics. Donnie may be right. If we had held off on the guns, maybe until the second term.
Because the other issues were so important to the governor. I mean, I know this was an important issue too, but it didn't have the impact in the state as the education and the auto insurance. Those were important issues that had to be addressed in your mind. That was the one issue I thought you could have put off.
You may be right, but it isn't clear, at least not to me, that even if you take guns out, and certainly that would have changed the dynamic a good bit, but there was still the tax question. And there was still, if we were going to solve this problem at all, we were going to have to do it with an income tax, we were going to have to do it with a sales tax, and that was going to have its own political impact in 1991, whether guns had been at issue or not.
Yeah, I think in retrospect, Steve and Don, guns I thought was the right thing to do from a wholesale level and a retail level. I think we could have, the party could have survived doing guns. And I came from a district, as you know,
so than me.
where that was not an easy thing to do. My sense is that, again, you're dealing in a recession, and you're dealing with where people are much like today. They're experiencing great financial hardship. And then they hear about increase in the sales tax, expanding the sales tax, increase in the income tax, and they don't understand why. And I think the thing is that if you're going to do a budget problem and fix the budget, you fix the budget. And then if you do an overall reformulation of school funding in the state of New Jersey, you better be out there making the case as to why. And I thought that was and again, there was a moral question as to whether we continue to let this fester, and then there was the retail question as how are we going to survive this politically. And believe me when I tell you that there were guys in our caucus, guys and ladies in our caucus, who understood what they were doing. They understood what they were doing. And to their credit, along with Governor Florio's, they just started to move forward, and I'm sure Joe feels the same way.
Senator Kenny.
Well, I was a very junior assemblyman, starting my third year, and Joe Doria from Hudson County was the speaker, so I would have done anything asked of me. And I did. But I just want to say I've known Governor Florio for 30 years. And I drove him around in Hudson County in 1981, and we used to make all these stops. And then I of course, served during his term as governor. And in 2000, Bob Januszewski called a meeting in the casino in the park in Jersey City of all the Hudson County Democratic Organization people. So about 30 of us arrived there, and they had all the chairs stood up, and Bob Januszewski had a podium. He was the chairman at the time. And the purpose of this was who were we going to support for U.S. Senator. And and that we were going to bring John Corzine, because the word was it was going to be Corzine, and that we were going to bring him, later on that day to meet with him at the casino. So he makes the spiel as to why we should support Corzine. So he goes, so everybody's okay with that. So I raised my hand. And I don't know if you remember this.
I remember this.
And I said, well, what about Governor Florio? Why aren't we inviting him here to talk to us? And it was dead silence. And so he said, well, we've already decided, everybody, Corzine. And I said, well, I think we should bring Governor Florio in for the same opportunity to meet with us. So So that didn't go anywhere. Then, but there's the best part. So Januszewski then reaches back. There was a curtain. He pulls the curtain open, and Corzine steps out.
I remember that.
Yeah. Corzine steps out from behind the curtain, and I said, "Uh-oh." But getting back to this whole thing, I was very junior, so my perspective now is from my experience since then. But these things are always very hard to judge. You know, Duke of Wellington, after the Battle of, which was with Napoleon, Waterloo, he said it was a very close thing. And you know, things are always very close, you know, in politics. Bart Giamatti said that baseball is a metaphor of life. Football is politics, and politics is football, and where, you know, there are winners and losers. The only thing I would say is that there was a great consequence to the debacle of 2001. I mean, Donnie wouldn't agree with this, but you know, we lost 20-some assemblymen and 10 senators, and we went. Dick Coffey at the time said we'd be in the minority for 10 years, and we were. 1991. 91. Right, in the minority for 10 years, and then you know, we elected a Republican governor in 1993, and the consequences going back to 91 to today are direct, and there are consequences to politics. And so I can't say what we should have done differently. Again, I was very junior. I will say, in our caucus, in that assembly caucus in the annex, repeatedly people were expressing concerns. Dan Jacobson, John Villapiano, Tom Dutch, Lou Gill, Marlene Lynch Ford, and I remember Tom Devrin got up one day and said, we're doing too much. People knew that we were doing too much, and it wasn't a secret. And the thing that alarmed, we all have our the things that we look at as being ominous. What was ominous to me were the teachers. When we did the QEA with the pension thing and the teachers, and I really didn't understand what was going on then, but when we did that and the teachers met us outside that day in the parking lot, I said, we've got a problem, you know, because, you know, the teachers had turned on us, and that was to me the thing that was most alarming. But you know, Jamie Foxx really hit the nail on the head. What do you do when you come in with these majorities after winning 500,000 votes, with a governor who is known throughout New Jersey and respected, who has a mandate, you know, who lost to Tom Kaine 8 years earlier by 1,700 and some votes, and then he comes in and he wins? What do you do with that? You know, do you go for everything, or do you, you know, calculate it? And it's a tough question.
Well, let me pursue the point that Dan Dalton brought up. A number of governors who are pursuing education, which means education finance usually, education improvement means raising monies, have really gone retail. They've gone to the grassroots. They've had issue campaigns that have gone on for 4, 6, or 8 months. Bill Clinton did it that way. Dick Riley in South Carolina did it that way, and others. Was it ever considered seriously within the administration to go slower, but to get out into the communities of New Jersey and educate and sell the idea, or at least sort of get people much more accustomed to the
absolutely. The political strategy, the desired political strategy, Alan, was let the decision come down and do nothing. Let the governor go around, leading legislators go around, hold hearings. Let the pressure for a school funding come from the school districts. That they, because nothing was going to happen, and a resolution work its way out, knowing that we had likely the income tax there. But this goes back to a reading of how to move everything together, and the Assembly leadership's reading of its own caucus, and this question of how do you make it all fit? Because the political memos we were writing said this is not the right political strategy in terms of long-term retail politics.
One of the things that helped to get the votes in the end, and this, again, I don't know whether when he came into the caucus he had the authority to do this, but Phil Keegan of happy memory was the state chair. And he came in when we were having difficulty getting the votes to pass the budget and to do the QEA. He came in and said, look, I have a commitment from the governor and his people that if you get this done, we will go out there and do a mass media, retail, political campaign, that we will go on TV, that we will do everything possible. I don't know, Kathy, if you remember this. Kathy, I think Kathy Crotty remembers, probably said the same thing in the Senate caucus, that we're going to, he said this, and this helped to get the votes. Unfortunately, that never happened. I don't know whether he had the authority to do that. I don't know if he was talking through his hat. I believe Phil Keegan was an honest man. I believe he thought that was going to happen. But I think that, to my mind, is one of the big mistakes that occurred.
And I wasn't there for that, but I understand that. But look at it this way. If the choice that was presented, this was June of 1990. And from at least the Assembly's point of view, the Senate was up to 91 as well, but what I remember better is what we were hearing from the Assembly leadership. The choice was to do whatever we had to do in June of 1990 and spend the next 15 months doing what Phil Keegan.
But it never happened. Never happened, Steve.
I understand that.
Can I say something about this? I just, we're spending a lot of time, it seems to me, talking about the political calculations of what we could have done. I don't remember during the administration us spending a lot of time on the politics. I remember us spending a lot of time on the policy. And as I listen to us here today, I don't hear anyone saying that the governor's intentions on the policy or what he wanted to do or what he felt that we needed to do was misguided. It was probably the fact that we did so much in 6 months. And there wasn't a plan at that point to say, okay, over the next 6 months we're going to do these 5 things. And if we had to take one of them off the table, what would we take off the table? That's just not how it worked, internally. I think the governor was very determined to do those right things, as we said, attack the problems. And if, in retrospect, if we had looked back and said, if we could have had, the foresight to say, let's not do guns for another 5 months or 6 months, or let's not do education because that would make the difference in the political outcome, I'm not sure that we wouldn't have come to that conclusion. I just I don't recall us having those kinds of discussions.
We had the kind of discussion that was focused on if we do it in June of 90 as opposed to June of 91, we have 15 months. It didn't happen, you're right, but we had 15 months to address the issues. Whereas, said the Assembly leadership, if we do this in June of 91, we were going to have 5 months or 3 months or whatever it is between June and November with that vote hanging around our necks. That was, at least as I remember it now, the emphasis or the rationale, if you will, for the decision, the political decision, which we're all now second-guessing, and there's a lot of reason to second-guess, but that was the rationale for that decision at that time, that the choice was not to do it. The choice was to do it now or to do it later, and which was politically the least or the less damaging. The decision we made at that time was it was less damaging to do it in June of 90, and consequences
historically was true.
And the consequences were what they were.
Historically, that was the way you would do things the first year, get it out of the way. I can understand that thinking.
Which is exactly what Tom Kane did.
And every political theorist would say that. If you go to Machiavelli, if you go to anybody, any political theorist would say you do it fast, you get it over with, and then you move on, and you hope then you can sell it, and also people forget.
Well, it wasn't, and Brenda, we were moving quickly on a lot of fronts. There was a lot of, because it was a main point between Steve and myself as to the politics of letting the decision come down and letting the governor go out and educate about this issue because that's how it would be best politically for the governor and Steve, constantly saying we've got to respect the legislative process. Because I was the political, right, strategist coming out of the campaign. And, you know, you make your choice, as Steve says, and you go on. And, you know, we just didn't have the money, was the reality, to mount the political air war that we hoped to do. Where Phil made the promise, I just know where our coffers were at that point in order to be able to do it, right?
And I don't disagree with us having, that we had discussions about the impact of each particular piece of legislation politically in kind of the big sense, not the retail sense. What I think we didn't calculate is just the doing 5 or 6 things right after each other and the impact that would have politically. I don't disagree that we talked individually about the politics of guns or the politics of education.
But this goes back, 101.5, the NRA.
You couldn't have anticipated.
Right.
No way.
How that story got picked up and the underlying dynamics of New Jersey. Because the rally in Trenton that Hands Across New Jersey had, there were 5,000 people there. Right. We gave them a symbol with the toilet paper. Right. 35,000 people showed up in Hartford the same time to protest Governor Weiker's tax increase. It was a one-day story. In New Jersey, we would go to, because I talked to any number of reporters saying, follow the money trail. They just didn't want to do it. It wasn't the right story for them to follow. Because if the NRA participation had come out back in the summer of '90, when those dollars started to flow, the whole interpretation of what was going on would have been very different. And people already knew that. And reporters just weren't hungry.
Absolutely right. There was another event, though, that occurred, that affected Kathy Crotty, that affected the political outcome, particularly on the legislative side, and that was redistricting.
Right. Well, nobody mentioned that.
And I think that probably had a larger impact than any of these individual issues. Now, I think the way in which the issues affected that process was that we were so distracted by the reaction to all the things that we did, the negative reaction. There was a lot of bad feeling all the way around, and the Democrats never really sat down and figured out a game plan as to how we were going to approach it. And the Republicans did. And that's the year that they won the map. And I think that overall that probably had a much bigger impact on the legislative election. And because we just got our clock cleaned so badly, it wasn't simply a result of those issues that we dealt with.
And I want to agree with Kathy wholeheartedly. We did not pay attention to the reapportionment of the legislature. The Republicans, you sat on that reapportionment.
No, 81. I was in 81.
81.
Yeah.
But it was again our clock was clean.
Yeah,
and
so Steve,
the districts that were created were much more difficult districts for the Democrats. We learned our lesson. From that point on, we did much better. Much better. But that reapportionment, we got killed. So that obviously helped us to lose in 91. It was one of the other things.
Yes, that's partly true. I mean, we did lose a few seats later that we shouldn't have won in the first place. But remember, and I was, I was toying with the idea, what am I doing here in the minority for 15 years? I mean, I'm tired of this. But as soon as we saw, and I was down at Cafiro's headquarters because he was elected in 90. When I saw Christy Whitman's vote against Bill Bradley, we knew we were going to take control a year later. We knew. Just a matter of how many. We knew. It was, it was kind of, there's nothing that anybody could do from that point on. And you tried really hard. I mean, taxes went down. I mean, I know. I remember the taxes went down, and there was nothing that you could do to prevent this snowballing effect for the election.
And Donnie, just try this one. If instead what we did in June of 90 had been done in June of 91, in your view, what would have been the consequences in November of 91? Same thing.
You got killed, yeah.
No, and
I'm with you. You get it done. I mean, I had to vote for the income tax and the sales tax increase in 82.
Right. But that wasn't in 82. Wasn't during the Byrne administration when we created the income tax, which is earlier.
76.
The schools actually closed.
Yes, the Supreme Court in the summer of 1976
closed the school.
The Supreme Court closed the schools, and that's what forced the legislature to act.
There was an event, a focus where the public was focused on an event, okay, that caused the raising of the income.
You're right, but what I'm referring to is to compare 82, for example, to 90. In 82, in comes a new governor who's faced with what he's faced
like
with.
New Year's Eve or something like that?
It was December 30th. We went 24 hours into New Year's Eve.
Right.
It was 24 hours straight, and we passed every tax.
Right, and here comes a new governor who seeks, a Republican governor seeking from a Democratic legislature, both houses, seeking increases in all three taxes, okay, and a restructuring of the school funding as a part of it. Gets it all as a result of, now we negotiated, the Republicans had to put up all their votes, and we gave them enough to get it passed. And then because the economy in 82 and 83 and 84 was what it was compared to the economy in 90, and 91 and 92, Tom and the Republicans in general paid no political price for having done all of that. And God bless them for that. That's not a complaint, it's just an observation. The point is that we wound up 8 years later doing the same kind of thing and got killed.
Well, I don't think, sorry, I don't agree with that. I wasn't around in the 80s, but I don't think you can compare what happened in 90. There were 5-6 major things you did. You just didn't raise taxes. I believe if we had just, I know John Lynch, who I got to know very well years later, he thought we should have just done the sales tax and not done the guns and just take care of the budget the first year. Now, I know this thinking that do everything at once, but what's everything? So like that doesn't mean, well, because they don't want to do the sales tax, so we'll do the income tax and the sales tax. I mean, where's the logic there? I think mistakes were made. And that's why we learned from this. Mistakes were made. Political mistakes were made in 1990.
But did John Lynch press that on the Florio administration beforehand?
Yes. The Senate leadership's position was just as Bernie is suggesting. The Senate leadership's position is we should do in June of 90 as little as we have to do, which translates into, in this context, the sales tax for the budget. And the guns was a different question.
Wasn't it like $400 million?
I don't remember the number, but it was
much more.
It was larger than that.
The 1 cent is $1 billion.
Right. I mean, what was your education gap?
No, the income tax contributed about $1 billion.
About $1 billion?
It was $2.8 billion. Was the number, right? What was the breakdown between the sales?
It was never 2.8 other than in the press.
Right.
It was less.
Was it less?
Yeah, and the other thing that's different between 1982 and 1990, remember, 1982 was bipartisan. There were Democrat and Republican votes.
Well,
Everybody put up votes.
So let me say, I was only in the Senate, but the Democrats in the Senate pretty much passed the income tax increase, which was only 2.5 to 3.5. The Republicans provided most of the votes for the sales tax increase. I voted for Matty Feldman. He said, I got to go to Florida and take my grandchildren to Florida. Donnie, I won't be there. I said, all right, I'll vote for you. I swear to God, it's a true story.
Hey, in those days, you could do that, yes.
And I did.
The interesting
and
thing,
nobody cared, by the way.
Let me.
There were Republicans on all the bills, and there were Democrats on
all the bills.
Right.
But
and Tom didn't say nice things he didn't smile when he was signing these bills. Yeah. Remember, we were really mad, right? Remember that?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what I remember, and you and I were in the leadership positions at that point. What I think I remember is I don't remember. I think it was 23. It was either 23 to 17 or 22 to 18.
Yeah.
And I think I remember telling you, okay, on the sales tax bill, you're going to need 15, and on the income tax bill,
Right.
you're going to need 12 or 13.
Something
whatever
like
it was.
that, yeah.
We
Well,
had
we
a
always
number.
knew we had Gormley,
We had
and
a- right,
yeah.
we had a number. We gave
You always made a deal with him, yeah.
we gave you enough Democrats to get
Right.
to 21
Right.
on top of your caucus.
Right.
And the assembly was the same thing.
You know, Steve, and I know it's getting off the topic, but that first year of Kane's administration, he had just won by 1,722 votes or something. I guess you would know better than I.
1,797.
It was a good year. We actually tried to raise the gas tax. Remember that? And we failed. We failed. And he would never bring that up. Are you kidding? He wouldn't even bring up the sales tax increase. He didn't raise taxes.
He signed all three. His response to me was, "Well, if you'd have given me the
Gas
tax,
tax.
I'd sign that
Right.
too."
That was Carrie's thing. That was Carrie. We tried. Remember we were talking the other day. The only tax we haven't raised in New Jersey in 20 years is the gas tax. It's the only tax we haven't raised. I'm not. Why did you raise the sales? Why did you include the sales tax in the package? Why didn't you just raise the income tax?
Because you couldn't get enough money. You needed $2.5 billion to solve both problems. And, you know.
You just asked the question that we did ask in the assembly. We asked that question, and we were told that we couldn't get enough money because we just wanted to increase the income tax. Again, on the basis the income tax was progressive, it didn't hurt the poor people worse than everyone else. And that issue was an issue. You're absolutely right, Don.
Look, I mean, the challenge of government, right, because it's what changed even in your little tenure. The bankers would come in early in that administration and say, you know, if you want to change the pension funding assumption, the growth rate on the rate of return, you wouldn't have to fund the pensions, right? We said no. We said no throughout. Mrs. Whitman, very early on, first said, well, we don't need to fund it to the same level, and that's how she balanced the budget. And then she raised the growth rate assumption again.
Or Mr. One or the other, right?
And said, well, we can take money out of the pension fund because it's overfunded, you know,
Right.
if you assume a 10% growth rate. The legislators, as Senator Dalton said and the Speaker said, you know, they came to government to do real government, not to finesse it. And those are hard choices.
Let me again. I don't mean to be adversarial on this, but the art of politics is not getting too far ahead of the people. And we know in history, political leaders don't do what they have to do at that moment in time. They wait until till events occur, till things happen, till they can manage it, massage it, and then they get it done. And I think the panel here earlier, and Brenda Bacon, and I think you all said it. You were all driven to solve these problems in the first 6 months, and it's not politics and government is not only about solving problems. It's about winning elections, and that's a part of it too. And I think that was disregarded.
When the public employees aren't going to get their pensions in 10 years because that thing is $50 billion underfunded, who's going to tell them? Who's going to tell those children that the people who punted on the problem make the problem?
With you. As Brenda said, we're not arguing the policy. I mean, I understand the policy behind it all.
But the other thing about the politics is that it seems to me that nobody was exactly sure of what the right politics was at the time. It's easy to be reflective on it, but at the time, the administration was getting inconsistent, different signals from the Senate and the Assembly.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
that's life in
that's
politics.
life. So you got to choose.
Making the decision as to what is the right one, even if it's not the right one, entails making decisions.
Right.
Which is theoretically what the whole process of democracy is about. It's a decision-making process.
No, but there wasn't a legislature with an alternative. You didn't have an alternative policy. You didn't have an alternative strategy.
But that's not.
You
that's
had
not
a
really
lot
correct.
of different.
That's not correct. I mean, there were alternatives that were marginal alternatives. Not,
Okay.
The legislature is not capable. I mean,
No.
not the individuals. The legislative process is not capable of coming in with whole cloth proposals. That's why we have an executive branch. The legislature then sort of nibbles around the edges, perfects things, and does things of that sort. And they, for example, I mean, the modification off the school funding, that was thought of as going to be more property tax relief. So we took, I think, $400 million out of the funding system for that. So, I mean, they made dramatic modifications, but they were incremental modifications.
Well, let me ask you this, which is a little tangential. During your administration, did the legislature come up with any major initiatives that you responded to?
No major initiatives, no.
Okay.
Let me, on that point, it doesn't, legislatures in my 20 years there, the way it works is that the governor exerts the leadership and the administration. And we're largely reactive. And there's an overwhelming desire on the part of the majority party, if it has its governor in the front office, is to support him or her. It's overwhelming. You know, people don't deviate from that. It's not the human nature. You know, if you're part of a group and you want to succeed, you support your governor. And it's an incredibly powerful thing. No matter how upset people may be, they do what the governor wants.
Bernie, I would suggest to you that Republicans are better at that than Democrats.
Yeah.
Both in Trenton and in Washington.
Yeah, I don't disagree.
I mean, just to reinforce that point to a bit, dealing with the Republican veto-proof majorities in the second 2 years resulted in actually some good things happening. So when the Republican Party had some responsibilities, there was more collaboration. The first 2 years, there was no collaboration, no cooperation at all, because I didn't have any responsibility. So the legislature, in the last 2 years, collaborated with us in the sense that they were willing to engage and come forward with negotiations to make some changes going forward.
Dan?
I'm not so sure with regard to the legislature just plays at the edges, nor it's just reactive. Because, again, in the previous 8 years during the Caden administration, we held the Senate. And in many policy areas we led, we didn't follow. The administration reacted to us. We didn't react to the administration. And so I don't think that broad statement I would buy into.
So Governor Florio is right. When you have responsibility.
I'm not done. Okay. The second point I would make is during Governor Florio's administration, there was a meeting of the minds as to what we would do at the outset. And in his first 6 months, believe me, from a policy making perspective, there was the automobile insurance. Not inconsequential, okay? But that was an agreement between leadership and the governor, okay? There was guns, not inconsequential. Again, an agreement between the legislature and the governor's office. So things were not just done by caveat, by any stretch of the imagination, nor were they done in Governor Kane's administration by pronouncement. It really depends upon the dynamic that is at play at the time. I remember, again, during the Kane administration in the Senate where we held control, oftentimes significant policies came out of the Senate, not out of the governor's office. So in this case, we were the governors and the legislature were of the same party. So as a result,
you agree?
Yeah, we agreed on.
Senator Kennedy, do you want to retort here?
Well, my experience is that was the exception to the rule. What Dan is talking about was the exception from my 20 years experience. That the governor's office in Trenton controls the agenda, and the legislature, not that they don't have inputs, but you're talking about 120 people versus one, and concentrated power versus diffuse power. People get accommodated, people have input, but and on some issues, some people have leadership roles, like Wayne Bryant did on welfare reform. But as a general rule, this is how that was my experience, is that it comes from the front office and track.
I think that I would agree with both Dan and Bernie in the sense that when you have a governor and a legislature of the same party, it's more likely that the legislature will follow the governor. When you have a legislature and a governor of different parties, then the legislature has more initiative and more reason to take more leverage to take the lead on some major issues. So it depends upon the interaction and the fact of whether they are of the same party or different parties.
Well, the governor will let you take the lead.
Well, right, exactly. And if you have opposition, you have an opposition situation where the legislature's one party, the governor's another, then the legislature is going to try to take the lead to take some clout away from the governor.
And Governor Florio, would you like to come up here and have the last word about all of this? I mean, you haven't really been defamed, so you're lucky.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say this has been very enjoyable and interesting for me, and hopefully for you as well. The only substantive point I would inject, which was not talked about a little bit today, was the environmental issues, which we focused on as well early on. I guess there wasn't as much controversy as there is with some of these issues, but some of you may recall, look around, some of you are old enough to recall the 80s, that the Jersey Shore was closed much of the 1980 season, the 88 season, 89 season. And we campaigned saying we were going to, I'm the big environmental guy, so I'm going to go up and clean up the shore. And actually we did. We passed some very strong legislation. Some of the money that we raised, we used to fund $1.5 billion worth of upgrading wastewater treatment facilities down at the shore, which was one of the major catalysts for the problems down there. So that was a good issue as well. It gave us some points. The only 2 points I wanted to raise was, one is that the difficulty of governing in a state like New Jersey with the whole media situation. I mean, one of the things that we did a lot of, and some of you can recall this, was go out to town meetings. In the middle of all of the disarray, in the middle of all of the angst that was out there, we did a whole lot of town meetings, and for the most part, the town meetings were very good. They didn't get reported as being very good. I remember going down to Washington Township, and we had a fairly hostile audience to start with. I explained what I was doing, explained why we're doing it, and the group sort of slowly but surely came around. But there was one guy jumped up and said, Governor, you're the worst governor since Pontius Pilate, which I thought was kind of an interesting analogy. And the way that the report the next day was, there were some people who were favor, some people opposed. It was like 299 to 1, but he got equal play. So it's a difficult thing to try to do. I would just conclude with the observation that, and we got a little sense of this in the legislative discussion here at the end, is that a lot depends upon the personalities. A lot depends, because I recall Governor Kane had serious problems with Alan Karcher, who has a very forceful personality, and in some respects you almost had a question of who's the governor and who's not the governor. And Alan Karcher really effectively forced the governor to sign all the things he had pledged not to sign, that is, all the tax bills. My personality is a bit different than other people's personality, and therefore we had a little more ability to get things through that were not as difficult, not as easy to do. But also you engage in the way that you feel comfortable with. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier that was a source of great pride to me was having the vote that stopped the overriding of my veto of the gun ban, which obviously was in the second administration. That was an issue that started out, we repealed the gun authorization in New Jersey, and then the new legislation came in, and we were able to, they were able to override, they were able to repeal the gun ban. What I did, excuse me, was to veto the repealer. Legislature went, the Assembly went first very quickly in the middle of the night, and they overrode my veto.
Yeah.
And then what we had was the Senate took a couple of weeks to get themselves organized. And in that period of time, we did what was one of the most things I'm most proud of. We organized an effort to get people informed and engaged, and went around the state, and I think Donnie remembers this. We went around the state and had the medical people involved, teachers involved, the clergy involved, a whole lot of folks were involved, and we brought the issue to the highest level, reducing it to the argument that is New Jersey really better off with more access to Uzis and AK-47s. And to make a long story short, with that concept of engagement and information, we got to the point where when the vote came, not a single senator in the whole legislature was willing to vote to override my
So I don't
veto.
get any credit for that. He's taking all the credit.
And it was a tribute to the whole idea of participatory democracy. And so I regard that as a very important thing because it really represents my philosophy. That engagement of citizens and information to citizens is really the essence of public policy. And that's me. Obviously, other people have different views. I tease a lot of people who are political opponents, not enemies, but political opponents. Over the years, I've become friends with, Tom Kane being one of them. And I tease him from time to time about how he had all these wonderful creative ideas, the Performing Arts Center, the aquarium, Civic Square, a whole bunch of different things. And then he left and I had to pay for them. But I just want to express my appreciation to Eagleton for all of the good, hard work they put in. And hopefully we'll have other opportunities to come together and think about governing, think about public policy. Thank you.